picture a sun-soaked Caribbean paradise, the Golden Palm Hotel, where Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster, arrives for a quiet holiday. But beneath the tropical charm lies a deadly secret. When Major Palgrave is poisoned after sharing a fae, mysterious photograph, and a curious maid meets a fatal end, Miss Marple unravels a chilling plot of greed and betrayal. As Tim Kendall's charming facade crumbles and his lover's dark role is exposed, only Miss Marple's keen mind can stop a killer before they strike again. Dive into a Caribbean mystery where every smile hides a motive and danger lurks in paradise. Chapter 1. Arrival at the Golden Palm. The Caribbean sun blazed over the island of St. Honoré, its rays glinting off the turquoise sea and bathing the Golden Palm Hotel in a golden glow. Miss Jane Marple, a slight figure in a pale lilac dress, stepped gingerly from the taxi, her eyes blinking against the unfamiliar brightness. Her nephew Raymond, ever solicitous, had arranged this escape from the damp chill of St. Mary Mead, insisting the tropical warmth would soothe her rheumatism. Miss Marple, though touched by his concern, found the vividness of the scene. The swaying palms, the riot of bougainvillea, the lilting cadence of island voices, almost overwhelming. She clutched her straw hat, its brim sensibly wide, and allowed a porter to guide her to the hotel's open-air reception, where ceiling fans stirred the humid air. The Golden Palm was a charming sprawl of whitewashed bungalows, their verandas, draped with jasmine, connected by paths of crushed coral that crunched underfoot. Miss Marple, after signing the guest book with her neat, angular script, was shown to her room, a cool haven with louvered windows and a bed draped in mosquito netting. She unpacked methodically, placing her knitting bag on a wicker chair, and, her Bible on the bedside table, her movements precise despite the faint ache in her joints. The sea murmured beyond her window, and she paused to listen, reminded of the tides at St. Mary Mead, though here the rhythm felt wilder, less predictable. By late afternoon, Miss Marple settled on the main veranda, a shaded expanse overlooking a lawn where guests lounged in canvas chairs. Her knitting needles clicked softly, producing a shapeless square she never intended to finish. It was, after all, merely a prop to encourage conversation. She observed her fellow guests with the quiet acuity of one long accustomed to village life. There was Canon Prescott, a jovial clergyman with a booming laugh, accompanied by his sister Joan, whose pince-nez and penchant for birdwatching marked her as fastidious. Mr. Raphael, a gaunt, wealthy invalid, held court from a cushioned chaise, his sharp tongue and sharper eyes belying his frailty. The hotel's owners, Tim and Molly Kendall, moved among the guests with practised grace. Tim, boyishly handsome with a quick smile, and Molly, her auburn hair catching the light, her laughter bright but faintly strained. As the sun dipped, casting long shadows across the lawn, Miss Marple accepted a glass of limeade from a waiter, its tartness refreshing. She was joined at her table by Major Palgrave, a ruddy-faced retiree whose military bearing was softened by a slight stoop. His tweed jacket, incongruous in the heat, and his habit of addressing everyone as my dear fellow, suggested a man reluctant to leave his colonial past behind. He launched into a tale of his days in Kenya, his voice carrying over the clink of glasses. Miss Marple listened with an air of gentle interest, her eyes half closed, though she noted every detail. The Major's fondness for rum punch, the way, His anecdotes circled back to his own heroism, and the worn leather wallet he patted absent-mindedly. "And then," Palgrave said, leaning closer, his breath tinged with spirits, "there was the case of the murderer I met in 48. A clever devil looked you straight in the eye and lied like a saint. He fumbled with his wallet, extracting a creased photograph. 'Got his picture here, believe it or not. Care to see?' Miss Marple inclined her head, her needles pausing. The photograph showed a man in profile, unremarkable save for a certain hardness in his jaw. Before she could study it further, Palgrave's gaze flicked past her shoulder. His joviality vanished, replaced by a fleeting unease. "On second thought," he muttered, tucking the photograph away, "it's not worth boring you with." He launched into a rambling story about tiger hunting, his earlier thread abandoned. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression bland, but her mind was alert. She glanced discreetly at the veranda's other occupants. Tim Kendall was pouring wine for a giggling couple, his charm effortless. Molly adjusted a vase of hibiscus, her fingers lingering as if to steady herself. Mr. Sir Raphael's nurse, a sturdy woman named Jackson, hovered nearby, her face impassive. The canon was reciting poetry to a bemused guest, while Joan Prescott sketched a palm tree in her notebook. Had one of them caught Palgrave's eye, prompting his sudden reticence? Miss Marple filed the moment away, like a scrap of gossip from St. Mary Mead, knowing that even the smallest detail could unravel a larger truth. Dinner was served under a canopy of stars, the air heavy with the scent of frangipani. Miss Marple, seated between the canon and a quiet botanist named Edward Hillingdon, savoured the spiced fish and plantain, though she ate sparingly. The conversation turned to the island's history, its pirate coves and sugar plantations, but her thoughts lingered on Palgrave's aborted story. She recalled a similar incident in her village, a man who'd stopped mid-sentence at a garden party, his secret betrayed by a glance. That man, she mused, had been hiding an affair. What was Palgrave hiding, and why had he faltered? As the idyllic meal ended and the guests drifted to the bar or their bungalows, Miss Marple remained on the veranda, her silhouette frail against the lantern light. The Caribbean night was warm, but she sensed a chill beneath its beauty, a shadow that her sharp eyes were already beginning to trace. Chapter 2. A Sudden Death. The morning sun rose over St. Honoré, its light filtering through the palm fronds and casting dappled patterns across the Golden Palm Hotel's veranda. Miss Jane Marple sat at a wicker table, her breakfast of papaya and toast untouched, her knitting resting idle in her lap. The air was already warm, carrying the salty tang of the sea and the distant hum of a gardener's shears. She had risen early, as was her habit, her sleep undisturbed by the tropical heat but faintly troubled by the memory of Major Palgrave's abrupt silence the previous evening. His photograph, that fleeting glimpse of a hard-jawed man, lingered in her mind, as did the unease that had crossed his face. Miss Marple, accustomed to the small betrayals of village life, knew that such moments often hid truths too dangerous to speak aloud. The veranda, usually alive with the clatter of breakfast trays and the chatter of guests, was subdued. A knot of staff huddled near the reception, their voices low, their faces drawn. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the absence of Molly Kendall's usual morning rounds. Her auburn hair and bright smile nowhere in sight. Tim Kendall, however, moved among the tables, his manner as affable as ever, though his eyes darted toward the staff's whispered conference. Miss Marple sipped her tea, its bitterness grounding her thoughts, and waited for the inevitable ripple of news to reach her. It came soon enough. Joan Prescott, the canon's sister, approached with the brisk step of one bearing important tidings. Her pince-nez glinted as she leaned toward Miss Marple, her voice hushed but eager. "My dear Miss Marple, have you heard? Such a shock! Major Palgrave passed away in the night." She paused, her hands fluttering like startled birds. "They're saying it was his heart, poor man. Dr. Graham was called at dawn, but it was too late." Miss Marple's expression softened into one of gentle concern, though her mind quickened. "Dear me, how very sudden," she murmured, her needles clicking once, as if to punctuate her words. "He seemed so full of life last evening, with all his stories. Was there no warning?" Joan shook her head, settling into the chair opposite. "None at all, from what I gather. The maid, Victoria, I think, found him when she brought his morning tea. He was still in bed, quite gone. The canon's been speaking with Mr. Kendall, trying to keep things calm. You know how these things unsettle a hotel." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the lawn, where Canon Prescott stood with Tim Kendall, their heads bent in earnest discussion. "Indeed," she said. "And what does Dr. Graham say?" "Oh, heart failure most likely," Joan replied, her tone authoritative despite its second-hand nature. "The Major was fond of his rum, wasn't he? And there was a bottle of those tablets, Serenity for blood pressure, by his bed. Dr. Graham thinks it was all quite straightforward, though dreadfully sad." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed by anyone less observant than herself. "Straightforward," she echoed, her voice mild. "Yes, I suppose it often seems so at first." She resumed her knitting, her fingers deft despite the faint stiffness of age, and allowed Joan to prattle on about the Major's habits, his loud laugh, his endless tales of colonial exploits. But her thoughts were elsewhere, circling the memory of Palgrave's hesitation, the photograph tucked away, the glance that had silenced him. The veranda began to fill as other guests emerged, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Mr. Raphael, wheeled out by his nurse Jackson, took his usual place near the railing, his gaunt frame swathed in a linen suit. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the scene, lingering on Tim Kendall before settling on Miss Marple. She met his gaze briefly, sensing a kindred scepticism beneath his gruff exterior. Lucky Dyson, the vivacious blonde, appeared with her husband Greg, their laughter a touch too loud, as if to drown out the morning's grim news. Edward and Evelyn Hillingdon followed, their steps measured, their expressions composed but distant, as though they carried private burdens. Miss Marple observed them all, her mind sifting through impressions like a gardener turning soil. Lucky's hand rested briefly on Tim Kendall's arm as he passed, a gesture too familiar for mere acquaintance. Evelyn Hillingdon's eyes, dark and watchful, flicked toward her husband, who seemed absorbed in a book, but turned no pages. Esther Walters, the hotel's secretary, hovered near the reception, her hands twisting a handkerchief, her face pale beneath her neat bun. Miss Marple noted these details, storing them as she might a village rumour, knowing that patterns often emerged from such fragments. She rose, her movements slow but deliberate, and made her way to the reception to inquire about a parasol, though her true purpose was to listen. The staff, still clustered, spoke in hurried Creole, their words unintelligible, but their tone urgent. Victoria, the maid Joan had mentioned, stood apart, her apron crisp, her eyes red-rimmed. Miss Marple approached her with the disarming smile of an elderly aunt. "My dear, you must be so shaken," she said. "Finding poor Major Palgrave like that, it's a dreadful thing." Victoria nodded, her hands smoothing her apron. "Yes, ma'am. He was just lying there so still. I thought he was sleeping at first." Her voice trembled, but she straightened, as if mindful of her duties. "Had he seemed unwell?" Miss Marple asked, her tone all sympathy. "I spoke with him last evening, and he was so lively, telling his stories." "No, ma'am, not unwell," Victoria said, hesitating. "He was always talking, laughing, but—" She glanced over her shoulder, her voice dropping. "He was asking me yesterday about some of the guests like he was curious. I didn't think nothing of it then." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her face remained placid. "Curious? About whom, I wonder?" Victoria shook her head. "He didn't say names, just asked if folks here were new or been coming years. I told him most were new, 'cept Mr. Raphael and the Kendalls, of course." She paused, then added, "I got to get back to work, ma'am. Sorry." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, patting her arm. "You've been very kind." She watched Victoria hurry off, her mind turning over this new thread. Palgrave's questions suggested he was probing, perhaps recognizing someone, or fearing recognition. The photograph, she thought, might have been more than a memento. Returning to her table, Miss Marple found Canon Prescott waiting, his round face creased with concern. "Miss Marple, I do hope this hasn't upset you," he said, his voice warm but tinged with pastoral duty. "Such a loss, though we must trust it was the Lord's will." "Very kind of you, Canon," she replied, her smile faint. "I'm quite all right, though it's a shock, isn't it? Did you know the Major well?" "Not well, no," the Canon admitted, settling beside her. "He was a regular here, though, came every winter. Full of stories, some a bit tall, I suspect." He chuckled, then sobered. "Tim Kendall's worried about the hotel's reputation, poor chap. He and Molly have worked so hard to make this place a success." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to Tim, who was now speaking with Dr. Graham, a silver-haired physician with a calm, professional air. "They do seem devoted to the place," she said. "It must be a strain, managing so many guests." "Oh, indeed," the Canon agreed. "Molly's been under the weather lately. Headaches, I hear. Tim's been a saint, looking after her." He lowered his voice. "Between you and me, I think they've had financial worries. Hotels are such a gamble." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her face all innocent interest. "Financial worries? Dear me, that's hard with such a lovely place." The Canon hesitated, as if regretting his candour. "Well, nothing serious, I'm sure. Just the usual ups and downs." He brightened, changing the subject. "Have you seen the Islands Church yet? Quite charming, built in 1780. Miss Marple allowed him to steer the conversation, her mind elsewhere. Financial strain, she thought, could push people to desperate acts, as she'd seen in St. Mary Mead, when a shopkeeper's debts led to theft. She filed the Canon's remark alongside Victoria's, sensing the faint outline of a puzzle taking shape. Dr. Graham approached, his manner courteous but brisk. "Miss Marple, I hope you're not too distressed by this morning's news," said. "I've just been reassuring Mr. Kendall that there's no cause for alarm. Major Palgrave's heart condition was known, and these things, sadly, do happen." "How very reassuring," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "You examined him, I presume?" "Yes, briefly," Dr. Graham replied. "No need for a full autopsy, given his medical history. The Serenity tablets confirmed it. He'd been taking them for years. A straightforward case, though tragic." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft but searching. "Straightforward," she murmured, echoing Joan's earlier word. "And no signs of anything unusual." Dr. Graham's smile was patient, as if accustomed to anxious guests. "None at all. The maid found him quite undisturbed, no signs of struggle. He simply slipped away in his sleep." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. Undisturbed, she thought, yet Victoria had seemed shaken beyond mere grief. And Palgrave's vigour last evening, his loud voice, his steady hand holding the photograph, did not suggest a man on the brink of collapse. She recalled a case in her village, an elderly farmer found dead in his chair, his death deemed natural until a neighbour's gossip revealed poison. First impressions, she knew, were often deceiving. As Dr. Graham departed, Miss Marple noticed Esther Walters lingering near the reception, her handkerchief now a crumpled ball. She approached, her steps slow, her smile disarming. "Miss Walters, you look quite pale," she said. "This news about Major Palgrave must be a dreadful shock." Esther started, her eyes wide. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple, it's awful. I didn't know him well, but he was so lively." Her voice faltered, and she glanced toward Tim Kendall, who was now laughing with Greg Dyson. "You help run this lovely hotel, don't you?" Miss Marple said, her tone all kindly curiosity. "It must be such a responsibility, especially at a time like this." Esther nodded, her fingers twisting the handkerchief. "Yes, it is. Tim and Molly depend on me for the accounts and bookings. I try to keep things smooth, but—" She trailed off, her eyes darting away. "But it's not always easy," Miss Marple finished, her voice soft. "You're very brave to carry on so well." She paused, then added, "Did you see Major Palgrave last evening by chance? He was telling me such interesting stories." Esther's face tightened, almost imperceptibly. "No, I didn't. I was working late, sorting invoices. I heard him talking, though. He was always talking." She excused herself abruptly, hurrying toward the office. Miss Marple returned to her seat. Her knitting resumed, though her hands moved mechanically. Esther's nervousness, she thought, was more than the strain of a death. It reminded her of a young clerk in St. Mary Mead, whose fidgeting had betrayed her theft from the church fund. Secrets, Miss Marple knew, left traces in the eyes, the hands, the voice. The morning wore on, the veranda emptying as guests sought the beach or their bungalows. Miss Marple remained, her tea cold, her gaze distant. She thought of Palgrave's photograph, his sudden reticence, his questions to Victoria. She thought of Tim Kendall's easy charm, Molly's absence, Esther's trembling hands, and she thought of the bottle of serenity, so conveniently found, so neatly explanatory. In St. Mary Mead, such tidiness often masked a lie. Mr. Raphael, passing, in his wheelchair, paused beside her. "You're mighty quiet, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Not buying this heart failure business, are you?" Miss Marple's eyes met his, her smile faint but knowing. "Oh, I'm sure Dr. Graham is very competent," she said, "but I do find sudden deaths curious, don't you? Raphael's laugh was a dry bark. "Curious, eh? You're sharper than you look, old girl." He wheeled away, but his glance back held respect. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting idle now. The Caribbean sun climbed higher, its heat unrelenting, but she felt a chill, as if the shadow of Palgrave's death had settled over the golden palm. She would watch, she decided, and listen, as she always did. For if there was one thing Miss Marple knew, it was that death, like gossip, rarely travelled alone. Chapter 3. The Photograph. The Caribbean morning unfurled with a languid grace, the sun climbing over St. Honoré to gild the Golden Palm Hotel in hues of amber and coral. Miss Jane Marple, seated on the veranda with her habitual cup of tea, felt the warmth seep into her bones, easing the faint ache of her rheumatism. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, a prop for the moment unneeded, as her eyes, sharp beneath their mild exterior, surveyed the scene. The lawn stretched before her dotted, with guests in straw hats and linen, their voices a low hum against the rhythmic crash of distant waves. Yet the air held a subtle tension, a residue of Major Palgrave's sudden death that lingered like a faint mist, unnoticed by most, but palpable to Miss Marple's honed instincts. She sipped her tea, its bitterness a familiar anchor, and reflected on the previous day's revelations. The Major's heart failure, so neatly explained by Dr. Graham, had left her uneasy, not least because of his vigour during their last conversation. His photograph, that creased image of a hard-jawed man, and his abrupt silence when someone approached, gnawed at her. In St. Mary Mead, such hesitations often betrayed secrets. A farmer's glance at a rival, a spinster's pause before a lie. Miss Marple knew that secrets, like weeds, thrived in the cracks of human behaviour, and she was determined to root them out. The veranda was quieter than usual, the guests subdued as they navigated the delicate balance of mourning and vacationing. Canon Prescott, his round face flushed from the heat, was holding forth to a small group about the island's flora, while his sister Joan sketched in a notebook, her pencil scratching with precise strokes. Mr. Raphael, ensconced in his wheelchair, near the railing, muttered to his nurse Jackson, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Tim Kendall moved among the tables, his smile as polished as ever, though Miss Marple noted a faint strain in his posture, a tightness that belied his easy banter. Molly Kendall, however, remained absent, her absence a silent note in the hotel's rhythm. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Lucky Dyson, whose blonde curls bounced as she sauntered onto the veranda, her laugh cutting through the morning's calm. She was followed by her husband Greg, a broad-shouldered American with a genial air, and the Hillingdons, Edward and Evelyn, whose reserved demeanour contrasted with the Dysons' exuberance. The group settled at a table nearby, their conversation lively but tinged with the forced cheer of those avoiding an unpleasant truth. Miss Marple, her expression one of benign disinterest, listened as their voices carried over the clink of coffee cups. "Poor old Palgrave," Lucky was saying, her tone more theatrical than sincere. Always going on about his adventures. I swear he told the same tiger story 3 times last week. She laughed, tossing her head, but her eyes flicked toward Tim Kendall, who was clearing a tray nearby. Greg chuckled, his hand resting lightly on Lucky's arm. He was harmless enough. Probably bored us to death before his heart gave out. His laugh was hearty. But Miss Marple noted a quick glance at Edward Hillingdon, who sat silent, his book unopened. Evelyn Hillingdon, her dark hair pulled into a sleek chignon, stirred her tea with a delicate hand. "It's sad, of course," she said, her voice low and measured, "but these things happen, especially at his age." Her eyes met Edward's briefly, a flicker of something, tension perhaps, passing between them. Miss Marple, her knitting now in hand, seized the moment. "Oh, I quite agree," she said, her voice tremulous with the frailty she often exaggerated. "Though I did enjoy his stories, even the tall ones. He showed me a photograph last evening, you know. A most intriguing man he'd met years ago. I wonder if any of you saw it." The group fell silent, a pause so brief it might have gone unnoticed by a less observant listener. Lucky's smile froze, her fingers tightening on her glass. Greg's laugh faded, his eyes narrowing slightly. Edward Hillingdon's hand, resting on his book, twitched, while Evelyn's teaspoon clinked against her saucer. Miss Marple, her face all innocent curiosity, watched them, her mind cataloguing their reactions like a botanist noting rare specimens. "The photograph?" Lucky said, recovering first. "Oh, he was always waving those old pictures around. I never paid much attention." Her laugh was brittle, and she turned to Tim, who had approached with a fresh pot of coffee. "Tim, darling, you must have heard Palgrave's stories 1,000,000 times. Did he show you anything?" Tim's smile was effortless, but Miss Marple noted the brief hesitation in his movements. "Can't say he did," he replied, pouring coffee, with practised ease. "The Major liked to talk, but I was usually too busy to listen." He moved on, his back straight, though Miss Marple sensed a wariness in his gait. Edward Hillingdon cleared his throat, his voice dry. "I don't recall any photograph," he said, his eyes fixed on his book. "Palgrave's tales were rather repetitive." Evelyn nodded, her composure restored, though her fingers lingered on her teaspoon. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly. "Oh, I'm sure it was nothing important," she said. "Just an old lady's fancy. My memory isn't what it was." She let the lie hang, knowing it would disarm them, and resumed her knitting, her eyes half closed but missing nothing. The group's quick recovery, she thought, was too polished, their denials too uniform. Someone, she was certain, had seen that photograph, or feared its implications. She rose, her movements slow, and announced her intention to take a morning stroll to the beach. The path wound through hibiscus and oleander, the air heavy with their scent, and she walked with the careful steps of one mindful of uneven ground. The beach was a crescent of white sand, fringed by palms and lapped by turquoise waves. A few guests lounged under umbrellas, their voices mingling with the cries of gulls. Miss Marple settled on a bench, her parasol shielding her from the sun, and watched as Lucky and Greg Dyson appeared, their laughter echoing as they splashed into the surf. Edward Hillingdon followed, his botanist's notebook in hand, pausing to examine a cluster of sea grapes. Evelyn, elegant in a wide-brimmed hat, walked alone, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, considered her next move. The photograph, she suspected, was the key to Palgrave's death, its image a threat to someone at the Golden Palm. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a faded letter found in an attic had unravelled a blackmail scheme. Photographs, like letters, could hold power, their mute testimony dangerous to those with secrets. She resolved to learn more about the guests, their histories, their connections to Palgrave. Her opportunity came at luncheon, served in the hotel's open-air dining room where ceiling fans stirred the humid air. Miss Marple, seated with Joan Prescott, steered the conversation with the skill of a village gossip. Joan, ever eager to share, obliged with a litany of observations about the guests. "Lucky Dyson's quite the flirt," she said, her pince-nez glinting. "Always teasing Tim Kendall, though I'm sure it's harmless. Greg doesn't seem to mind, but then he's so easy-going." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her fork poised over a slice of mango. "They seem a lively couple. Have they been coming here long?" "Oh, this is their first year," Joan replied. "The Hillingdons, too. Edward's studying the island's plants. Rather dull, if you ask me. Evelyn's very refined, but there's a coolness between them, don't you think? I heard they go. Lost a child years ago, poor things. It does strain a marriage." Miss Marple nodded, her face all sympathy. "How sad. And the Kendalls? They must be under such pressure, running this lovely place." Joan leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Oh, yes, the hotel's a dream, but I've heard whispers they borrowed heavily to buy it. Tim's charming, but Molly's been off lately. Headaches, nerves. The Canon thinks it's the strain of it all." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained placid. "Nerves can be so trying," she said. "I do hope she's all right." She filed Joan's gossip away, noting the financial strain, the Hillingdons' strained marriage, Lucky's flirtations. Each detail was a thread, and she was beginning to see the faint outline of a pattern. After luncheon, Miss Marple retired to the hotel's library, a cool room lined with faded novels and travel guides. She found Joan there, browsing a guide to Caribbean birds, and seized the chance to probe further. "Miss Prescott," she said, her voice tremulous, "you know everyone so well. Did Major Palgrave ever mention anything unusual about the guests? He seemed so curious about people." Joan frowned, her pencil tapping her notebook. "Unusual? Well, he was always asking questions. Where people were from, what they did. I remember he asked me about the Dysons, whether Greg was in business. I told him I didn't know, but he seemed, well, suspicious, almost." "Suspicious?" Miss Marple echoed, her needles pausing. "How curious." "Yes, it was odd," Joan admitted. "He dropped it quickly, though, and started talking about cricket. I thought he was just being nosy." She hesitated, then added, "He did mention once that he'd met someone here before, years ago, but he wouldn't say who. I assumed he was exaggerating." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind racing. Palgrave's questions, his hint of recognition, suggested he had stumbled onto something or someone familiar. The photograph, she thought, might have been a clue to that recognition, its image a link to a past crime or scandal. She recalled a St. Mary Mead incident, where a stranger's face in a crowd had sparked a widow's memory of a long-ago theft. Faces, she knew, could betray as much as words. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple returned to the veranda, her knitting a shield against idle chatter. She watched as Tim Kendall conferred with Esther Walters, their heads bent over a ledger, their voices low. Esther's hands, she noted, were unsteady, her glances toward Tim frequent and furtive. Lucky Dyson, passing by, called out a playful remark, but Tim's laugh was curt, his eyes flicking to Esther. Miss Marple, her face bland, wondered if Lucky's flirtations were more than harmless, if they masked a deeper entanglement. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Miss Marple, her tea cold, felt her familiar stirring, the sense that the golden palm was a stage, its players hiding truths behind their smiles. She thought of Palgrave's photograph, its image burned into her memory, and of his sudden death, so convenient for someone. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that death was rarely an accident when secrets were at stake. She would continue to watch, to listen, to knit, her frail figure a quiet sentinel in the tropical dusk. For Miss Marple knew that the truth, like a photograph, would eventually come into focus, revealing the face of a killer. Chapter 4. A Second Tragedy. The Caribbean sun hung high over St. Honoré, its relentless heat softening the edges of the Golden Palm hotels, whitewashed bungalows, and casting sharp shadows across the coral paths. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual spot on the veranda, felt the warmth press against her cotton shawl, but her mind was cool, sifting through the unease that had settled over the hotel since Major Palgrave's death 2 days prior. Her knitting lay untouched, her tea cooling in its cup, as her eyes, deceptively mild, traced the movements of guests and staff. The Major's photograph, his faltering story, and the too convenient diagnosis of heart failure lingered in her thoughts like a half-remembered tune from her village church. She knew, from years of unravelling St. Mary Mead's small scandals, that sudden deaths often hid deliberate hands, and she sensed such a hand at work here. The veranda, usually a hub of laughter and clinking glasses, was subdued, the guests' voices hushed as they navigated the delicate etiquette of grief. Canon Prescott stood by the railing, his round face sombre as he spoke with a young couple, offering pastoral comfort. His sister Joan, her pince-nez catching the sunlight, scribbled in her notebook, her bird-watching forgotten. Mr. Raphael, wheeled out by his nurse, Jackson, glowered from his cushioned chaise, his sharp tongue silenced but his eyes alert, darting from face to face. Tim Kendall moved among the tables, his charm a polished veneer, though Miss Marple noted a faint tremor in his hand as he poured coffee. Molly Kendall, still absent, was a silent absence, her absence a whisper of trouble that no one dared voice. Miss Marple sipped her tea, its tartness grounding her, and reflected on her morning's findings. She had spoken with the gardener, a wiry man named Joseph, who had mentioned Palgrave's habit of wandering the grounds at dusk, his eyes scanning the bungalows as if searching for someone. Joseph had also let slip that Victoria Johnson, the book maid who found Palgrave, had been unusually cheerful lately, hinting at extra money from an unnamed source. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as her knitting needles, filed these details away, sensing they were pieces of a larger mosaic, one she had yet to fully discern. Her reverie was broken by a sudden stir near the reception. A young waiter, his face ashen, hurried toward Tim Kendall, his words inaudible but urgent. Tim's smile faltered, and he excused himself, striding toward the hotel office with a haste that belied his usual composure. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her instincts pricking, like a cat's whiskers. She rose, her movements slow to avoid attention, and made her way toward the lawn, where a cluster of staff had gathered, their voices a low buzz of Creole and English. She lingered near a hibiscus bush, her frail figure blending into the scenery, and listened. The news, when it reached her, was a jolt, though her face betrayed only a flicker of concern. Victoria Johnson, the cheerful maid who had discovered Palgrave's body, had been found dead that morning near the cliffs, her body sprawled on the rocks below. The police, led by Inspector Daventry, a methodical man with a clipped moustache, had been called, and the staff whispered of an accident, a slip in the dark, a tragic misstep. Miss Marple, her hands clasped beneath her shawl, felt a chill despite the heat. 2 deaths in as many days, she thought, were no coincidence, not in a place as small as the Golden Palm. She returned to the veranda, her step deliberate and settled. Into her chair, her knitting resumed as a shield against curious eyes. The guests, now aware of the tragedy, reacted with a mix of shock and unease. Lucky Dyson, her blonde curls dishevelled, clutched Greg's arm, her voice shrill. "First Palgrave, now this? It's like a curse!" Greg, his geniality strained, patted her hand, his eyes scanning the veranda as if seeking reassurance. Edward, Hillingdon, his botanist's notebook forgotten, stood with Evelyn, their faces composed but their postures rigid, as if braced for further blows. Esther Walters, the hotel's secretary, hovered near the reception, her handkerchief a-crumpled. What, her eyes red-rimmed and darting. Miss Marple observed them all, her mind turning over the new development. Victoria's death, labelled an accident, echoed a case in St. Mary Mead, where a milkman's fall from a ladder had masked a push from an angry wife. She recalled Victoria's brightness, her hint of extra money, and her casual remark to another maid, overheard by Miss Marple the previous day, about something odd in Palgrave's room. The maid's death, she suspected, was no more accidental than Palgrave's, and the timing suggested a connection, a thread she was determined to follow. She approached Canon Prescott, who stood alone, his face creased with worry. "Canon, what a dreadful thing," she said, her voice tremulous with the frailty she wielded like a tool. "Poor Victoria. I spoke with her only yesterday, such a kind girl. Was it truly an accident?" The canon sighed, his hands clasped behind his back. "So they say, Miss Marple. Inspector Daventry's looking into it, but the cliffs are treacherous at night. She might have been walking, lost her footing." He shook his head. "It's shaken us all, especially after Palgrave." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes soft but searching. "She seemed so cheerful, didn't she? I wonder if she'd been troubled by anything, perhaps about Major Palgrave's death." The canon frowned, his brow furrowing. "Troubled? I hadn't thought so. She was a good worker, always smiling. Though—" He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "The staff do talk, you know. I overheard one of them say Victoria was asking questions about Palgrave's medicine, the Serenity tablets. She thought, it's strange, but I'm sure it was nothing." Miss Marple's needles clicked, her face all innocent interest. Strange? How curious! Did she say why? No, no, the canon said, waving a hand. Just servants' gossip, I expect. She was, probably confused. He brightened, changing the subject. Have you tried the island's coconut tarts? Quite delightful. Miss Marple smiled, allowing the diversion, but her mind seized on the canon's words. Victoria's curiosity about the serenity tablets, she thought, might have led her to danger. She recalled a St. Mary Mead chemist whose idle question about a prescription had uncovered a poisoning. Small details, she knew, could unravel great crimes. She sought out Inspector Daventry, finding him near the reception, his notebook open, his pen scratching. He was a man of middle years, his face lined from years under the Caribbean sun, his manner courteous but firm. Miss Marple approached with the diffidence of an elderly spinster, her smile disarming. "Inspector, I do hope I'm not intruding," she said. "I was so fond of Victoria, such a dear girl. Is it certain she fell by accident?" Daventry's eyes met hers, assessing but not unkind. "Miss Marple, is it? We're treating it as an accident for now. The cliffs are steep, no guardrails, and it was dark. Her injuries are consistent with a fall." He paused, then added, "No signs of a struggle, if that's what you're wondering." Miss Marple nodded, her face all sympathy. "Oh, I'm sure you're very thorough. It's just she seemed so careful, so sensible. I wonder if she'd seen something, perhaps about poor Major Palgrave, that troubled her." Daventry's pen paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Seen something? Did she mention anything to you?" "Oh, nothing specific," Miss Marple said, her voice vague. "Just a remark about something odd in his room. I thought it might be worth mentioning." She smiled, her eyes guileless, knowing the seed was planted. Daventry made a note. "Its expression unreadable. I'll look into it, Miss Marple. Thank you for your concern." He excused himself, striding toward the cliffs, where a constable waited. Miss Marple returned to her chair. Her knitting resumed, her mind racing. Victoria's death, she was certain, was tied to Palgrave's. The two linked by something the maid had seen or suspected. The serenity tablets, so neatly explanatory, might have been a plant, as she'd seen in a village case where a bottle of aspirin masked a lethal dose. She needed more information, and she knew where to turn. She found Mr. Raphael later that afternoon, seated in the garden, his wheelchair positioned beneath a frangipani tree. His nurse, Jackson, stood nearby, her face impassive, but Raphael waved her away with a curt gesture. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "you've got that look again. Not swallowing this accident nonsense, are you?" Miss Marple settled on a bench, her shawl adjusted against the breeze. "Oh, Mr. Raphael, I'm sure the police know their business," she said, her tone mild. "But two deaths so close together do make one wonder, don't they?" Raphael's laugh was a bark, his eyes glinting with approval. "Wonder, eh? You're a sly one. I saw Victoria yesterday, you know. She was tidying my bungalow, humming like she'd won a prize. Said she'd come into some money, didn't say how." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "And I saw her talking to Tim Kendall near the cliffs, day before Palgrave died. Looked like an argument, though I couldn't hear." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her face remained placid. "An argument? How very interesting. Did she seem upset? More like stubborn, Raphael said, kept shaking her head like she wasn't buying what he was selling. Tim walked off in a huff. He shrugged, his bony shoulders sharp under his linen shirt. Might mean nothing, but you're the type to make something of it, Miss Marple thanked him, her mind turning over this new thread. Victoria's money, her argument with Tim, her questions about the Serenity tablets, all pointed to a secret, one that had cost her life. She recalled a St. Mary Mead maid, whose eavesdropping on a quarrel had led to her dismissal, and later a confession of theft. Servants, she knew, saw more than they were meant to. As evening fell, the hotel's atmosphere grew heavier, the guests' chatter forced, their glances wary. Miss Marple, dining alone, observed the dynamics with a clinician's eye. Lucky Dysons. Laughter was too loud, her hand lingering on Greg's arm as if to anchor herself. Edward Hillingdon's silence was a wall, Evelyn's composure a fragile mask. Esther Walters, serving coffee, spilled a drop, her hands trembling as Tim passed, his smile curt. Miss Marple, her fork poised over a slice of fish, noted these signs, sensing a web of fear and guilt beneath the hotel's polished surface. She retired early, her bungalow cool and quiet, the sea's murmur a distant lullaby. But sleep eluded her, her mind too busy weaving threads. Palgrave's photograph, Victoria's curiosity, Tim's argument, the Serenity tablets. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a second death, a gardener's accident, had confirmed a village poisoner. Here, too, she sensed a pattern, a killer moving to silence those who knew too much. She would continue to watch, to listen, her frail figure a quiet sentinel in the Caribbean night. For Miss Marple knew that truth, like the tide, would eventually reveal what lay hidden beneath the surface. Chapter 5. Miss Marple Investigates. The Caribbean dawn broke over St. Honoré with a soft radiance, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold that reflected off the tranquil sea. At the Golden Palm Hotel, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the faint hum of morning activity, but an undercurrent of unease persisted, as palpable as the heat that already shimmered on the horizon. Miss Jane Marple, seated on the veranda in her customary wicker chair, felt the warmth seep into her joints, easing the stiffness of age, though her mind was anything but idle. Her knitting lay folded beside her, a prop for later use, as her eyes, sharp beneath their gentle veneer, scanned the scene. The deaths of Major Palgrave and Victoria Johnson, so close together, had cast a shadow over the hotel, and Miss Marple, with the instincts honed by years of unravelling village intrigues, sensed a deliberate hand at work. Her tea, served in a delicate porcelain cup, was cooling, its tartness a familiar anchor as she sifted through her thoughts. Palgrave's photograph, that fleeting image of a hard-jawed man, and his sudden reticence before his death, gnawed at her. Victoria's fall from the cliffs, deemed an accident by Inspector Daventry, seemed too convenient, especially given her curiosity about the Serenity tablets and her unexplained windfall. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead case, where a baker's sudden wealth and subsequent accident had revealed a blackmail scheme. Here, too, she suspected a hidden truth, one that linked the two deaths in a pattern only she could discern. The veranda was quieter than usual, the guests' chatter subdued, their movements cautious, as if fearing the shadow that had fallen over their tropical idyll. Canon Prescott stood by the lawn, his round face creased with concern as he spoke with a waiter, while Joan Prescott, her pince-nez glinting, jotted notes in her ever-present journal. Mr. Raphael, wheeled out by his nurse, Jackson, occupied his usual spot, his gaunt frame swathed in linen, his eyes glinting with a cynicism that Miss Marple found oddly comforting. Tim Kendall, ever the gracious host, circulated among the tables, his smile a practised mask, though Miss Marple noted a faint pallor beneath his tan, a tension in his jaw that betrayed his composure. Molly Kendall's continued absence was a silent note, her empty chair at the reception desk a reminder of the hotel's strained harmony. Miss Marple's morning had begun early, her sleep light but untroubled, her mind too active for rest. She had taken a slow walk through the hotel grounds, her parasol shielding her from the rising sun, her steps deliberate as she sought out the staff who moved unseen by most guests. At the kitchen garden, she found Joseph, the wiry gardener, pruning a hedge with meticulous care. Adopting her guise of a kindly spinster, she engaged him in conversation, her voice soft with sympathy for Victoria's loss. "Such a dreadful thing," she said, her eyes misty. "She was so bright, wasn't she? I wonder if she'd been worried about anything, poor dear." Joseph, wiping sweat from his brow, nodded, his Creole accent warm but guarded. "Victoria was always smiling, ma'am, but she was excited lately, talking about money she got, maybe for a new dress or something. Didn't say where it came from, though." He paused, his shears still. She was asking about Major Palgrave, too, after he died. Wanted to know if he'd been sick before. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained placid. Asking about the Major. How curious. Did she say why? Joseph shook his head, resuming his pruning. "No, ma'am, just said it was strange, him dying so quick. I told her to leave it, not to stir trouble." He glanced at her, his eyes wary. She was a good girl, but maybe too nosy. Miss Marple thanked him, her smile disarming, and continued her walk, her mind turning over Joseph's words. Victoria's questions about Palgrave, coupled with her sudden wealth, suggested she had stumbled onto something dangerous, perhaps related to the Serenity tablets or the Major's photograph. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead housemaid whose curiosity about a guest's letters had led to her dismissal, and later a confession of theft. Servants, she knew, often saw what others missed, and Victoria's death suggested she had seen too much. Her next stop was Dr. Graham's office, a small bungalow near the hotel's entrance, its walls adorned with faded medical certificates. The doctor, silver-haired and calm, welcomed her with the courtesy of one accustomed to soothing anxious guests. Miss Marple, her shawl adjusted against the morning breeze, feigned concern for a minor ailment, then steered the conversation to Palgrave's death. I do hope it wasn't too distressing for you, Doctor," she said, her voice tremulous. "Such a sudden loss, and poor Victoria too. Was the Major's heart condition very severe?" Dr. Graham's smile was patient, his hands folded on his desk. "It was a shock, Miss Marple, but not entirely unexpected. Major Palgrave had high blood pressure, well documented. The Serenity tablets were prescribed for years. I examined him post-mortem, briefly, as the island's facilities are limited, and found no irregularities. Heart failure, sadly, can strike without warning." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but searching. "No irregularities at all. Suppose the tablets were exactly as they should be?" Dr. Graham's brow furrowed, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "The tablets? Yes, standard Serenity, same bottle I'd seen in his possession before. Why do you ask?" "Oh, just an old lady's fancy," Miss Marple said, her smile vague. "I heard Victoria was curious about them, and I wondered if she'd noticed. Anything odd?" The doctor's expression tightened, though his tone remained polite. "Victoria? I hadn't heard that. She was a capable girl, but not trained to judge such things. I'm sure it was nothing." He rose, signalling the end of the visit. "Rest assured, Miss Marple, it was a straightforward case." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing as she stepped into the sunlight. Dr. Graham's certainty, she thought, was too absolute, his dismissal of Victoria's curiosity too quick. She recalled a St. Mary Mead pharmacist whose insistence on a prescription's legitimacy had masked his own tampering. The Serenity tablets, she suspected, warranted closer scrutiny, though she lacked the means to examine them herself. Her final inquiry was with Inspector Daventry, whom she found near the hotel's office, his notebook open, his pen poised. The cliffs where Victoria had fallen were cordoned off, a constable standing guard, and Daventry's face was lined with the strain of managing 2 deaths. Miss Marple approached with her usual diffidence, her parasol a prop of frailty. "Inspector, I do hope I'm not troubling you," she said, her voice soft. "I was so fond of Victoria, and I can't help wondering if her death was truly an accident. She seemed so careful, so sensible." Daventry's eyes met hers, his gaze assessing, but not unkind. "Miss Marple, we've been over the scene thoroughly. The cliffs are steep, no railing, and the path was slick from evening dew. Her injuries, fractures, bruising, are consistent with a fall. No evidence of foul play." He paused, then added, "You mentioned yesterday she'd seen something odd in Palgrave's room. Did she elaborate?" Miss Marple shook her head, her expression one of gentle regret. "No, I'm afraid not. Just a passing remark, but it struck me as curious, especially after her questions about the Major's medicine. I thought you should." "No." Daventry made a note, his lips pursed. "I'll follow up with the staff, see if anyone heard her say more. But I must caution you, Miss Marple, not to let your imagination run wild. These are tragic incidents, but likely unrelated." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes guileless. "Oh, I'm sure you're right, Inspector. I'm just a silly old woman prone to fancies." She thanked him and withdrew, knowing her suggestion would linger, a pebble in his shoe. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Constable, whose dismissal of a widow's concerns had delayed a murder's discovery. Daventry, she hoped, would prove more receptive. By midday, Miss Marple returned to the veranda. Her knitting resumed as she watched the guests. Lucky Dyson and Greg were at the beach, their laughter echoing faintly, while Edward and Evelyn Hillingdon sat apart, their silence a chasm. Esther Walters, sorting papers at the reception, glanced nervously at Tim Kendall, who was laughing with a guest, but whose eyes were shadowed. Miss Marple, her needles clicking, noted these dynamics, sensing a web of secrets beneath the hotel's polished surface. Her thoughts were interrupted by Mr. Raphael, who wheeled himself beside her. His nurse dismissed with a wave. "You've been busy, Miss Marple," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Poking around, asking questions. Don't think I haven't noticed." Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "Oh, Mr. Raphael, I'm just a curious old lady, keeping myself amused. But you're very observant, aren't you? Have you seen anything interesting?" Raphael's eyes glinted, his bony hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Plenty. Take Tim Kendall, for instance. Saw him talking to Palgrave a few days before he died, out by the bungalows. Looked like a row. Palgrave red in the face, Tim all tight-lipped. Couldn't hear what they said, but it wasn't friendly." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "And Esther Walters, she's been jumpy as a cat, especially around Tim. Something's eating her, mark my words." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained placid. "A row with Palgrave? How very intriguing. And Miss Walters, such a capable young woman, but perhaps under strain." "It's strain, my foot," Raphael snorted. "She's hiding something. I know the type. Seen it in boardrooms, seen it in hospitals. Guilt's a heavy load, Miss Marple, and she's carrying it." He sat back, his eyes narrowing. "You're on to something, aren't you? Don't play the doddering spinster with me." Miss Marple's laugh was soft, her eyes twinkling. "You're very perceptive, Mr. Raphael. Let's just say I find coincidences unsettling. Two deaths so close together do make one wonder." Raphael's grin was wolfish. "Wonder? Hey, keep wondering, old girl. You're sharper than most of 'em here." He wheeled away, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. She leaned back, her knitting idle, her mind weaving threads. Palgrave's argument with Tim, Victoria's questions, Esther's nervousness, the Serenity tablets. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a grocer's quarrel with a customer had led to a fatal accident. Here, too, she sensed a pattern. A killer silencing those who knew too much. She would continue to probe, to listen, her frail figure a quiet sentinel in the Caribbean heat. For Miss Marple knew that secrets like shadows grew longer in the light of scrutiny, and she was determined to bring them into view. Chapter 6. Whispers of Motive. The Caribbean sun climbed higher over St. Honoré, its golden light bathing the Golden Palm Hotel in a deceptive glow of tranquility. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and oleander, and the distant murmur of waves mingled with the soft clink of breakfast dishes on the veranda. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her wicker chair, felt the warmth soothe her rheumatism, but her mind was sharp, slicing through the haze of tropical languor. Her knitting lay, idle, a prop for later, as her eyes, veiled by a gentle demeanour, traced the subtle currents of tension among the guests. The deaths of Major Palgrave and Victoria Johnson had woven a thread of fear through the hotel, and Miss Marple, with the quiet tenacity of a village sleuth, was determined to unravel its source. Her tea, now tepid in its cup, anchored her thoughts as she reviewed the tapestry of clues she had gathered. Palgrave's photograph, that brief glimpse of a hard-jawed man, and his abrupt silence suggested a recognition that had proved fatal. Victoria's fall from the cliffs, so neatly labelled an accident, bore the marks of deliberation, especially given her questions about the Serenity tablets and her mysterious windfall. Mr. Raphael's revelation of Palgrave's heated exchange with Tim Kendall coupled with Esther Walter's nervous glances, hinted at a deeper tangle of motives. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead scandal, where a grocer's whispered argument with a debtor had led to a staged mishap. Here, too, she sensed a hidden hand, orchestrating death to protect a secret. The veranda, though bustling with morning activity, carried a hushed quality, as if the guests were tiptoeing around the spectre of tragedy. Canon Prescott, his clerical collar slightly askew, chatted with a young couple, his voice warm but strained. Joan Prescott, her notebook open, sketched a hibiscus with mechanical precision, her usual chatter subdued. Mr. Raphael, stationed near the railing, muttered to his nurse, "Jackson," his gaunt face etched with suspicion. Tim Kendall, ever the charming host, navigated the tables with a smile, but Miss Marple noted a faint sheen of sweat on his brow, a flicker of unease in his eyes. Molly Kendall's absence, now a topic of whispered concern, hung over the scene like a missing note in a melody. Miss Marple's morning had been spent in quiet observation, her frail figure blending into the hotel's rhythm as she listened to the pulse of its secrets. She had lingered near the reception, where a young waiter, polishing silver, had let slip that Victoria had been seen near Tim Kendall's office the evening before her death, her face troubled. The waiter, unaware of Miss Marple's keen interest, had added that Victoria had mentioned a promise from someone, though she hadn't named them. Miss Marple, her mind as precise as her knitting stitches, stored this fragment, sensing it was a piece of the puzzle she was assembling. Her thoughts were interrupted by a burst of laughter from the lounge, where Lucky Dyson, her blonde curls, catching the light, held court with Greg and a few other guests. Her voice, bright but edged, carried to the veranda. "Tim, you're an angel to keep this place running," she called, as Tim passed with a tray of juice. "I swear, you're wasted on this island. You should be running a palace." Her laugh was teasing, but Miss Marple noted a sharpness in her tone, a glint in her eye that suggested more than casual flirtation. Tim's response was a chuckle, but his posture stiffened, and he glanced at Molly's empty chair by the reception. "Oh, I'm happy enough here, Lucky," he said, his voice light but strained, just trying to keep everyone smiling. He moved on, but Miss Marple caught the brief tightening of his jaw, the way his hand lingered on the tray. Molly Kendall, emerging at last, appeared in the lounge doorway, her auburn hair pinned loosely, her face pale beneath a forced smile. She greeted a guest with practised warmth, but her hands fidgeted with a scarf, and her eyes darted toward Tim, who avoided her gaze. Miss Marple, her knitting now in hand, watched this exchange, her mind recalling a St. Mary Mead wife whose nervous gestures had betrayed her husband's infidelity. Molly's unease, she suspected, was more than the strain of hotel management. Seizing an opportunity, Miss Marple approached Joan Prescott, who had moved to a shaded table, her notebook now closed. "Miss Prescott, you do look busy," Miss Marple said, her voice tremulous with the frailty she wielded so deftly. "I was just thinking of poor Molly Kendall. She seems so pale today. Has she been unwell?" Joan's pince-nez glinted as she leaned forward, her voice low with the relish of gossip. "Oh, Miss Marple, you've noticed it too? Molly's been dreadfully out of sorts, headaches, sleepless nights. Tim says it's just nerves, what with the hotel and all, but I wonder if there's more to it. She's been so jumpy, almost as if she's afraid of something." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her face all sympathy. "Afraid? Dear me, that's worrying. Has she said anything to you?" "Not directly," Joan admitted, her fingers tapping her notebook. "But the canon overheard her talking to Dr. Graham about nightmares. Something about shadows and guilt. Sounds fanciful, but I think she's under a terrible strain. And Tim, bless him, is so devoted, always watching over her." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but searching. "Devoted indeed. It must be hard for them, with so much responsibility. Have you noticed anyone else concerned for her?" Joan hesitated, her lips pursing. "Well, Esther Walters has been hovering around, Molly, almost like a nursemaid. But Esther's been odd herself, nervous, dropping things. I saw her slip a note to Greg Dyson yesterday, of all people. Most peculiar." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained placid. "A note to Mr. Dyson? How curious. Perhaps it was about hotel business." Joan snorted softly. "Hardly. Greg's no more involved in the hotel than I am. It looked secretive, the way she glanced around before handing it over." She paused, then added, "Mind you, I shouldn't gossip. It's probably nothing." Miss Marple smiled, her needles pausing. "Oh, we all have our little fancies, don't we? You've been most kind to indulge mine." She let Joan return to her sketching, her mind racing. Esther's note to Greg, coupled with her nervousness around Tim, suggested a hidden alliance, perhaps born of guilt or fear. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead seamstress, whose furtive letters to a neighbour had revealed a shared theft. Notes, she knew, often carried secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple sought out Esther Walters, finding her in the hotel office, sorting invoices with trembling hands. The room was cool, its shutters filtering the sunlight, but Esther's face was flushed, her eyes darting to the door. Miss Marple entered with the air of a confused guest, her shawl slipping slightly. "Miss Walters, I do hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her voice soft. "I was wondering if you could help me with a booking, but you look so busy. This dreadful business with Victoria must be such a strain." Esther started, her pen clattering to the desk. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's no trouble," she said, her voice high. "It's been difficult, yes. Victoria was so kind, and now this." Her hands twisted a paperclip, bending it out of shape. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle but piercing. "Such a shock, and after poor Major Palgrave. I heard Victoria was curious about his medicine. Did she ever mention anything to you?" Esther's face paled, her fingers stilling. "Medicine? No, I don't think so. She was always chatting, but nothing specific." She forced a smile, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. "I really must finish these invoices, if you'll excuse me." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone all sympathy. "I won't keep you." She withdrew, her mind noting Esther's evasion, her nervous haste. The young woman's fear, she thought, was palpable, a mirror to a St. Mary Mead clerk whose trembling hands had betrayed her role in a forgery. Esther, she suspected, knew more than she dared admit. As the afternoon unfolded, Miss Marple returned to the veranda, her knitting a shield as she watched the guests. Lucky Dyson and Greg lounged by the pool, their laughter a touch too loud, while Edward and Evelyn Hillingdon sat apart, their silence a quiet rift. Tim Kendall, conferring with a waiter, glanced at Molly, who stood by the reception, her scarf now knotted tightly around her neck. Miss Marple, her needles clicking, noted these dynamics, sensing a web of deceit woven through the hotel's daily rhythm. Her thoughts were interrupted by an encounter with Greg Dyson, who approached with his easy grin, a glass of rum punch in hand. "Miss Marple, you're always so calm," he said, settling beside her. "This place is getting to me, what with Palgrave and now Victoria. Makes you wonder who's next." Miss Marple's smile was faint, her eyes searching his face. "Oh, I'm sure it's just a sad coincidence, Mr. Dyson. But it does unsettle one, doesn't it? Did you know Victoria well?" Greg shrugged, his grin fading. "Not really. She was always around, cleaning, chatting. Seemed happy enough, though. I heard she'd come into some cash. Probably why she was out late, celebrating or something." He sipped his drink, his eyes flicking to Esther, who was crossing the lawn. Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing. "Celebrating, perhaps, or meeting someone. I heard she was seen near the cliffs, talking to someone before she fell." Greg's hand tightened on his glass. A fleeting tension. "Talking? News to me. Probably just staff gossip." He laughed, but it was forced, and he excused himself, his stride less casual than before. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting idle, her mind weaving threads, Esther's note, Victoria's money, Tim's argument with Palgrave, Molly's nightmares. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a wife's nervous fidgets had revealed her husband's plot to sell stolen goods. Here, too, she sensed a conspiracy, its strands tightening around the hotel's heart. She would continue to watch, to listen, her frail figure a quiet sentinel in the Caribbean light. For Miss Marple knew that motives like whispers grew louder in the silence, and she was determined to hear them clearly. Chapter 7. A Dangerous Night. The Caribbean night draped St. Honoré in a velvet cloak, its stars piercing the darkness above the Golden Palm Hotel, with a clarity that rivaled the lanterns flickering along the coral paths. The air was warm, heavy, with the scent of frangipani and the rhythmic pulse of distant waves. But an undercurrent of unease stirred beneath the tropical calm. Miss Jane Marple, her sleep elusive, sat by her bungalow's open window, her shawl drawn about her shoulders. Despite the heat, the deaths of Major Palgrave and Victoria Johnson had cast a pall over the hotel, and her mind, sharp as ever, wove together the threads of suspicion she had gathered. Palgrave's photograph, Victoria's questions, Tim Kendall's strange charm, and Esther Walters's furtive glances. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that danger often moved in the dark, and tonight she sensed it prowling close. Her day had been one of quiet probing, her frail figure a disguise for the relentless curiosity that drove her. She had spoken with a kitchen maid, who revealed that Victoria had been seen near Tim Kendall's office late one evening, clutching a small parcel, her face alight with secrecy. Another staff member, a porter, had mentioned Molly Kendall's recent habit of wandering the grounds at night, her movements erratic, her eyes distant. These fragments, like the gossip of her village, hinted at a deeper truth, one Miss Marple was determined to uncover. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widow whose midnight walks had masked her meetings with a thief. Molly's restlessness, she suspected, was no mere quirk, but a symptom of a greater malaise. As the hotel settled into silence, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound. A rustle of leaves, a soft footfall beyond her window. She leaned forward, her eyes adjusting to the dimness, and glimpsed a figure moving through the garden, a silhouette against the lantern-lit path. The figure was slight, its movements hesitant, and Miss Marple recognized the auburn hair and flowing scarf of Molly Kendall. Her heart quickened, though her face remained composed, and she rose, slipping on her shoes with the quiet precision of one accustomed to discretion. Molly's nocturnal wanderings, she thought, might reveal more than daytime pleasantries, and she resolved to follow, her instincts honed by years of village vigilance. She stepped into the night, her shawl a shadow about her, and moved along the path, keeping to the edges where the palms offered cover. The air was thick, the hum of crickets a soft chorus, and Molly's figure was just visible ahead, drifting toward the cliffs where Victoria had met her end. Miss Marple's steps were slow, her breath measured, her mind alert to every sound. She recalled a St. Mary Mead night, when she had trailed a poacher through the woods, his lantern betraying his theft. Here, too, she sensed a purpose in Molly's movements, a secret drawing her into the dark. Molly paused near the cliffs, her silhouette stark against the moonlit sea, and Miss Marple crouched behind a cluster of oleander, her heart steady despite the strain of her age. Molly's voice, low and fragmented, carried on the breeze, words like shadows and wrong, drifting to Miss Marple's ears. She seemed to be speaking to herself, her hands twisting her scarf, her posture one of agitation. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together Joan Prescott's gossip about Molly's nightmares, her talk of guilt. Was Molly tormented by knowledge, she wondered, or by something darker, a complicity she could not escape? Before Miss Marple could move closer, another figure emerged from the shadows, tall and purposeful. Tim Kendall, his white shirt gleaming in the moonlight. He approached Molly with soothing gestures, his voice a murmur, though Miss Marple caught phrases like, "Come back," and "You're not well." Molly resisted at first, her voice rising in a plaintive cry, but Tim's arm encircled her, guiding her gently toward their bungalow. Miss Marple, hidden in the oleander's embrace, watched them go, her mind noting Tim's tenderness, so at odds with the tension she had observed in him by day. As they disappeared, she crept closer to the spot where they had stood, her eyes scanning the ground for any clue, a dropped item, a mark in the sand, but found nothing. She lingered, her thoughts interrupted by a faint sound, a whisper, a rustle behind her. She turned, her senses sharp, and glimpsed a third figure retreating into the darkness, too swift to identify. Her heart thudded, but she remained still, knowing pursuit was futile. The figure's presence, she thought, was no coincidence, and she recalled a St. Mary Mead prowler, whose fleeting shadow had led to a burglar's arrest. Someone, she was certain, had been watching Tim and Molly, their purpose as hidden as the night itself. Miss Marple returned to her bungalow, her steps cautious, her mind alight with new questions. She settled by her window, her shawl drawn tight, and replayed the scene. Molly's murmurs, Tim's intervention, the unseen watcher. She considered Molly's fragility, so like a St. Mary Mead girl whose nerves had masked her lover's betrayal. Tim's devotion, she suspected, might be a facade, a means to control or conceal. The third figure, cloaked in shadow, suggested a conspiracy, its strands tightening around the hotel's heart. Dawn was breaking when Miss Marple finally retired, her sleep brief but untroubled, her resolve firm. She rose early, her morning walk a pretext to observe the hotel's waking rhythm. The veranda was quiet, the guests still abed, but the staff moved with subdued efficiency, their faces marked by the weight of recent events. Miss Marple approached, a young waiter, his tray balanced with practised ease, and inquired about Molly with the air of a concerned aunt. "I do hope Mrs. Kendall is feeling better," she said, her voice soft. "She seemed so unwell yesterday." The waiter, his eyes wary, nodded. "She's resting today, ma'am. Mr. Kendall says she's not to be disturbed. Been having bad dreams, they say." He hesitated, then added, "She was out last night, walking by the cliffs. Not safe, if you ask me." Miss Marple thanked him, her smile disarming, and moved on, her mind noting the confirmation of Molly's wanderings. She sought out Mr. Raphael, finding him in the garden, his wheelchair positioned beneath a tamarind tree, his nurse dismissed with a curt wave. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "you're up early. Chasing ghosts, are you?" She settled on a bench, her shawl adjusted against the morning breeze. "Oh, Mr. Raphael, just an old lady's restlessness," she said, her tone mild. "But I did notice Mrs. Kendall last night, walking near the cliffs. She seemed so distressed. Have you seen her like that before?" Raphael's eyes glinted, his bony hands gripping his chair. "Molly? She's been a wreck lately, jumpy, pale, like she's seeing things. Saw her myself a few nights back, muttering by the pool. Tim's been hovering like a nursemaid, but I don't buy his saint act." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "He's got something to hide, mark my words. I heard him last night after he brought Molly back, whispering to someone in the garden. Couldn't see who, but he said, 'It's under control.' Sounded like a man covering his tracks." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained placid. "Whispering? How very intriguing. Did you hear anything else?" Raphael snorted, his grin wolfish. "Not a word, but I know a schemer when I see one. Tim's too smooth always, has been, and Molly's not just sick, she's scared or guilty. You figure out which, Miss Marple. You're the one with the nose for it." She thanked him, her smile faint but knowing, and returned to the veranda, her knitting resumed as a shield against curious eyes. Raphael's words, she thought, were a crucial thread. Tim's whispered assurance, the unseen listener, Molly's fear. She recalled a St. Mary Mead husband, whose late-night calls had revealed his plot to sell forged paintings. Tim's control, she suspected, was a mask for manipulation, perhaps tied to the deaths that had shaken the hotel. As the morning unfolded, Miss Marple watched the guests with renewed focus. Lucky Dyson and Greg lounged by the beach, their laughter a forced echo, while Edward and Evelyn Hillingdon sat apart, their silence a quiet chasm. Esther Walters, serving tea, dropped a spoon, her hands trembling as Tim passed, his nod curt. Miss Marple, her needles clicking, noted these signs, sensing a web of fear and deceit tightening around the hotel's heart. She approached Canon Prescott at luncheon, finding him alone, his face creased with pastoral concern. "Canon, I do worry about Mrs. Kendall," she said, her voice tremulous. "She was out last night near the cliffs. It's so dangerous with all that's happened." The canon sighed, his hands clasped. "Poor Molly. She's been unwell, Miss Marple. Nightmares, Dr. Graham says. Tim's been a rock, but I fear she's not herself. I saw her yesterday staring at the sea as if she saw something dreadful." He paused, then added, "I pray it's just exhaustion, but these tragedies haven't helped." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but searching. Exhaustion, perhaps, or something weighing on her mind. Did she ever mention Major Palgrave or Victoria? The canon frowned, his brow furrowing. "Not directly, though she did ask me once if I thought Palgrave's death was natural. I assured her it was, but she seemed unconvinced." He shook his head. "I put it down to nerves." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. Molly's question, she thought, suggested suspicion, perhaps born of something she had seen or heard. She recalled a St. Mary Mead wife, whose idle query about a neighbour's death had revealed her own complicity. Molly, she suspected, was either a victim or a pawn in a larger game. As evening approached, Miss Marple retired to her bungalow, her thoughts a tapestry of clues. Molly's wanderings, Tim's whispers, the unseen watcher, Esther's note. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a night's vigil had exposed a village swindler. Here, too, she sensed a conspiracy, its strands converging in the dark. She would remain vigilant, her frail figure a quiet sentinel in the Caribbean night, knowing that danger, like the tide, waited for no one. Chapter 8. The Photograph Resurfaces. The Caribbean sun hung low over St. Honoré, its rays slanting through the palm fronds to bathe the Golden Palm Hotel in a warm amber glow. The air was thick with the scent of salt and hibiscus, and the soft crash of waves provided a rhythmic backdrop to the evening's quiet hum. Miss Jane Marple, seated on the veranda in her familiar wicker chair, felt the tropical breeze stir her shawl, but her mind was far from the languid beauty of the scene. Her knitting lay idle, her tea untouched, as her sharp eyes, veiled by a gentle demeanour, sifted through the web of suspicion that had tightened around the hotel. The deaths of Major Palgrave and Victoria Johnson, linked by threads of secrecy and fear, demanded her attention, and she was determined to uncover the truth hidden beneath the hotel's polished surface. Her thoughts circled the elusive photograph. Palgrave had shown her, its image of a hard-jawed man, a fleeting clue to his murder. Victoria's death, so soon after her questions about the Serenity tablets, suggested she had stumbled onto a dangerous truth. Tim Kendall's whispered assurances in the garden, Molly's nocturnal wanderings, and Esther Walter's nervous note. To Greg Dyson wove a pattern Miss Marple recognised from St. Mary Mead, where a single misplaced word had unravelled a village conspiracy. She knew that the photograph, if found, might hold the key to the killer's identity, and she resolved to pursue it with the quiet tenacity that had served her so well. The veranda was sparsely populated, the guests' usual chatter muted by the weight of recent events. Canon Prescott stood by the lawn, his clerical collar gleaming as he spoke with a waiter, his voice a soothing murmur. Joan Prescott, her pince-nez catching the fading light, sat alone, her notebook closed, her face drawn. Mr. Raphael, wheeled to his usual spot, glowered at the horizon. His nurse Jackson, a silent shadow at his side. Tim Kendall moved among the tables, his charm a practised veneer, though Miss Marple noted a faint tightness in his smile. A glance toward the reception, where Molly, pale but present, greeted a guest with strained courtesy. Miss Marple's day had been one of careful manoeuvring, her frail figure a disguise for her relentless curiosity. She had begun with a visit to the hotel's lounge, where she engaged the canon in a seemingly idle chat about Palgrave's habits. Adopting her guise of a vague spinster, she mentioned the photograph, her voice tremulous. "Such a pity about poor Major Palgrave," she said, her eyes misty. "He was showing me a picture that evening, you know. A man he'd met long ago. I wonder if it's still in his room." The canon's brow furrowed, his hands clasped. "A picture? I don't recall him mentioning it, Miss Marple, but he was always full of stories. I do remember him saying something odd, though, about a dangerous face he'd seen in a photograph. I thought he was just being dramatic." He chuckled, then sobered. "His things are still in his bungalow, I believe. The police haven't cleared them yet." Miss Marple nodded, her face all sympathy, but her mind seized on the canon's words. A dangerous face, she thought, was no idle boast, but a clue to Palgrave's fear. She recalled a St. Mary Mead vicar, whose chance remark about a stranger's portrait had led to a thief's capture. The photograph, she was certain, was still within reach, and she resolved to find it. Enlisting the canon's help, she proposed a search of the hotel's common areas, claiming she had misplaced a similar photograph of her own. "I'm so forgetful," she said, her voice quavering. "It might be in the library or the lounge, where I was chatting with the Major. Would you be so kind as to help me look?" The canon, ever obliging, agreed, and they spent the morning combing the lounge's wicker chairs and the library's dusty shelves, their search yielding nothing but a few stray novels and a forgotten scarf. Miss Marple, undeterred, noted the canon's earnestness, his lack of guile, a contrast to the guarded faces around her. Her next move was to approach Evelyn Hillingdon, whom she found in the garden, her elegant figure bent over a sketchbook, her pencil tracing the outline of a palm. Miss Marple, her parasol a prop of frailty, settled on a nearby bench, her smile disarming. "Mrs. Hillingdon, your sketches are lovely," she said, her voice soft. "I was just thinking of poor Major Palgrave. He showed me a photograph that evening, such an interesting face. Did he ever share it with you?" Evelyn's pencil paused, her dark eyes flickering with a momentary unease. "A photograph?" she said, her voice measured. Yes, I think he did show me something, briefly. A man, rather ordinary-looking, taken years ago. I didn't think much of it." She resumed, her sketching, her hand steady but her lips tight. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her face all innocent curiosity. "Ordinary-looking, you say? How curious. Did he say who it was?" Evelyn shook her head, her eyes fixed on her sketch. "No, he didn't. Just one of his stories. You know how he was. I'm afraid I wasn't paying much attention." She offered a faint smile, but Miss Marple noted the tension in her posture, the way her fingers gripped the pencil. "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said, rising with a sigh. "I'm sure it's nothing important." She withdrew, her mind racing. Evelyn's admission, however guarded, confirmed the photograph's existence, its image a potential threat. She recalled a St. Mary Mead artist, whose sketch of a stranger had sparked a neighbour's memory of a fraud. Evelyn's unease, she suspected, stemmed from more than disinterest. As evening approached, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a visit from Inspector Daventry, who approached her table with a courteous nod. His face was lined, his eyes weary from the strain of 2 investigations. "Miss Marple, I've followed up on your suggestion about Victoria," he said, his voice low. "The autopsy results came in today. Traces of poison, barbiturates, not naturally occurring, were found in her system. It's no longer an accident. We're treating it as murder." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained placid. "Poison?" she murmured, her eyes soft but searching. "How dreadful! Does this change your view of Major Palgrave's death?" Daventry's lips pursed, his pen tapping his notebook. "We're reviewing it, but his case still looks like heart failure. No poison there, just the Serenity tablets, as prescribed. Still, 2 deaths in a week. It's troubling." He paused, then added, "You've been asking questions, Miss Marple. If you hear anything more, you'll let me know." "Of course, Inspector," she said, her smile guileless. "I'm just a silly old woman, but I do worry about such things." She watched him go, her mind noting the shift in the investigation. Victoria's poisoning, she thought, was a deliberate act, its method echoing a St. Mary Mead case, where a gardener's tea had masked a lethal dose. The photograph, she suspected, had sparked a chain of events, its image a catalyst for murder. Determined to press her advantage, Miss Marple sought out Mr. Raphael, finding him in the lounge, his wheelchair positioned by a window, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "you're sniffing around again. Got something new, haven't you?" She settled beside him, her shawl adjusted against the evening breeze. "Oh, Mr. Raphael, just an old lady's fancies," she said, her tone mild. "But I did hear about poor Victoria. Poison, they say. It makes one wonder about Major Palgrave's photograph, doesn't it? He showed it to me that evening, and now I think it might be important." Raphael's grin was wolfish, his bony hands gripping his chair. "Important, eh? You're not wrong. I saw Palgrave waving that picture around a few days before he died, showing it to Tim Kendall, of all people. Tim looked like he'd seen a ghost, went pale as a sheet. Palgrave laughed it off, but I'd bet my fortune that picture's at the heart of this mess." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her face remained placid. "Showing it to Tim? How very intriguing. Did you see the man in it?" Raphael shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "Not clearly. Some fellow in a suit looked like an old snapshot. But Tim's reaction, that was the giveaway. He's hiding something, Miss Marple, and you're the one to dig it out." He leaned back, his grin fading. "Watch yourself, though. Whoever's behind this doesn't play nice." She thanked him, her smile faint but knowing, and returned to the veranda, her knitting resumed as a shield against curious eyes. Raphael's revelation, she thought, was a crucial thread. Tim's reaction to the photograph, his whispered assurances in the garden, his control over Molly. She recalled a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper, whose pale face at a customer's jest had betrayed his role in a smuggling ring. Tim, she suspected, was at the centre of the web, his charm a mask for darker deeds. As night fell, the hotel's atmosphere grew taut, the guests' laughter forced, their glances wary. Miss Marple, dining alone, observed the dynamics with a clinician's eye. Lucky Dyson's flirtations with Tim were bolder, her hand brushing his as he poured wine, while Greg watched with a forced grin. Edward Hillingdon's silence was a fortress, Evelyn's elegance a fragile veneer. Esther Walters, clearing plates, avoided Tim's gaze, her hands unsteady. Miss Marple, her fork poised over a slice of mango, noted these signs, sensing a conspiracy tightening its grip. She retired to her bungalow, the sea's murmur a distant lullaby, but her mind was too active for sleep. She sat by her window, her full shawl drawn tight, and replayed the day's findings. The Canon's dangerous face, Evelyn's guarded admission, Daventry's poison, Raphael's tale of Tim's fear. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a photograph in a parish album had exposed a bigamist. Here, too, she sensed the photograph's power, its image a spark that had ignited murder. She would continue to probe, to listen, her frail figure a quiet sentinel in the Caribbean night, knowing that the truth, like a star, shone brightest in the dark. Chapter 9. A trap is set. The Caribbean twilight settled over St. Honoré with a soft violet hush, the sky's fading light casting long shadows across the Golden Palm Hotel's manicured grounds. The air was warm, scented with jasmine and the faint tang of the sea, but a taut undercurrent of suspicion pulsed beneath the evening's calm. Miss Jane Marple, seated on the veranda in her customary wicker chair, felt the breeze stir her shawl, her knitting idle in her lap as her sharp eyes, masked by a gentle demeanour, scanned the scene. The deaths of Major Palgrave and Victoria Johnson had woven a web of fear through the hotel, and Miss Marple, with the quiet resolve of a village sleuth, was poised to unravel its strands. Her mind, as precise as her knitting stitches, turned over the clues she had gathered. Palgrave's photograph, Victoria's poisoning, Tim Kendall's guarded whispers, and Molly's haunted wanderings. Tonight, she sensed, was the moment to act, to draw the killer into the open. Her tea, cooling in its delicate cup, anchored her thoughts as she reviewed her strategy. The photograph, that elusive image of a hard-jawed man, had sparked Palgrave's fear, and she was certain his murder, Victoria's death, confirmed as poison by Inspector Daventry, suggested she had seen or suspected something lethal, perhaps tied to the Serenity tablets, or the photograph itself. Mr. Raphael's account of Tim's pale reaction to the image, coupled with Esther Walters' furtive note and Molly's fragile state, pointed to a conspiracy centred on the Kendalls. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead trap, where a carefully spread rumour about a stolen brooch had flushed out a thief. Here she would set a similar snare, using the photograph as bait to provoke the killer's hand. The veranda was quieter than usual, the guests' voices hushed, their movements wary, as if sensing the storm beneath the hotel's polished surface. Canon Prescott stood by the railing, his round face sombre as he gazed at the sea, while Joan Prescott, her pince-nez glinting, sat alone, her bird-watching journal forgotten. Mr. Raphael, wheeled to his usual spot, muttered to his nurse, "Jackson," his gaunt face etched with anticipation, as if he too sensed the night's potential. Tim Kendall, circulating among the tables, wore his charm like a well-tailored suit. But Miss Marple noted a faint tremor in his hand, a flicker of unease in his eyes as he glanced at Molly, who stood by the reception, her auburn hair pinned tightly, her smile strained. Miss Marple's day had been one of calculated preparation, her frail figure a cloak for her relentless purpose. She had begun with a conversation with Joan Prescott, knowing her penchant for gossip would serve as a megaphone. Adopting her guise of a vague spinster, Miss Marple leaned toward Joan at breakfast, her voice tremulous. "My dear Miss Prescott, I've been so forgetful," she said, her eyes misty. "I was telling the Canon about that photograph poor Major Palgrave showed me, you know, the one with the murderer's face. I'm sure I recognized the man in it, and I've just remembered where. I must tell Inspector Daventry tomorrow." Joan's eyes widened, her pince-nez slipping slightly. "Recognized him? Oh, Miss Marple, how thrilling! Who was it?" She leaned closer, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. Miss Marple shook her head, her smile vague. "Oh, I shouldn't say, not yet. My memory plays tricks, you know. But I'm certain it's someone here, and I'll sort it out soon." She let the words hang, knowing Joan's eagerness would spread them like wildfire. By luncheon, she overheard whispers among the staff, and by afternoon, Lucky Dyson was recounting the tale to Greg, her voice loud enough to carry. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, watched the ripple effect, noting Tim Kendall's sudden stillness as he passed, his eyes darting toward her. Her next step was to enlist Mr. Raphael, whose sharp mind and gruff candour made him an ideal ally. She found him in the garden, his wheelchair beneath a tamarind tree, his nurse dismissed with a wave. "Mr. Raphael, I need your help," she said, her voice low but firm, abandoning her usual frailty. "I've spread a rumour about Palgrave's photograph, claiming I recognized the murderer. I believe it will provoke the killer to act tonight. Will you watch my bungalow and alert Inspector Daventry if you see anything suspicious?" Raphael's grin was wolfish, his bony hands gripping his chair. "A trap, eh? You're a sly one, Miss Marple. I'll keep my eyes peeled. Nothing gets past me. But you're playing with fire. Whoever's behind this doesn't mess around." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "You think it's Tim, don't you?" Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "I think someone is very afraid of that photograph, Mr. Raphael. Let's see who comes to silence me." She thanked him and withdrew, her mind noting his relish for the game, his scepticism a mirror to her own. As evening deepened, Miss Marple prepared her bungalow, leaving the door unlocked and the curtains slightly ajar, a lure for the unwary. She sat by her bedside lamp, her knitting in hand, her frail figure a deliberate silhouette against the light. The sea's murmur was a distant lullaby, but her senses were alert, her heart steady despite the risk. She recalled a St. Mary Mead night when she had left her cottage gate unlatched to catch a vandal, his footsteps betraying his guilt. Here, too, she trusted the killer's fear would override caution, drawing them into her snare. The hours crept by, the hotel's sounds fading into silence, save for the occasional rustle of palms or the cry of a night bird. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes fixed on the sliver of moonlight through the window, her ears attuned to every sound. At last, a faint creak. The door, easing open, sent a thrill through her. She continued knitting, her movements slow, her breath even as a shadow crossed the threshold, tall and deliberate. The figure paused, then stepped closer. and in the dim light she glimpsed Tim Kendall's face, his features taut, his hand clutching a syringe that glinted with menace. Miss Marple's heart thudded, but her voice was calm, almost conversational. "Mr. Kendall, how kind of you to visit," she said, her needles pausing. "Is that for me?" Tim froze, his eyes wide with shock, the syringe trembling in his grip. Before he could respond, a shout broke the silence. Mr. Raphael's voice, sharp and commanding, followed by the thud of boots. Inspector Daventry burst through the door, his constable at his side, their lanterns casting stark shadows. Tim's face crumpled, the syringe dropping to the floor as the constable seized his arms, pinning him against the wall. Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping slightly, her composure unshaken. "Thank you, Inspector," she said, her voice soft. "And you, Mr. Raphael, for your vigilance." Raphael, wheeled to the doorway, grinned, his eyes glinting with triumph. Daventry's face was grim as he retrieved the syringe, his notebook open. "Tim Kendall, you're under arrest for attempted murder," he said, his voice clipped, "and I suspect we'll find more to charge you with. Care to explain this?" Tim's charm dissolved, his shoulders slumping, his voice a hoarse whisper. I had to stop her. She knew too much about the photograph, about Palgrave." He swallowed, his eyes darting to Miss Marple. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Miss Marple's eyes met his, her gaze steady, but not unkind. "You killed Major Palgrave, didn't you?" she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Because he recognized you from that photograph, from a past you thought buried." Tim's face twisted, a mix of defiance and despair. "He knew me from years ago, a fraud case in London. I'd changed my name, started over, but he saw me, showed me that damn picture, said he'd tell everyone." His voice broke. "I slipped poison into his rum, made it look like heart failure. The Serenity tablets were a cover, my own prescription, swapped out." "And Victoria?" Daventry pressed, his pen scratching. Tim's head bowed, his voice barely audible. "She found the real tablets in my office, started asking questions. I gave her barbiturates, lured her to the cliffs, made it look like a fall." He looked up, his eyes haunted. "I didn't want to, but she wouldn't stop." Miss Marple nodded, her face sombre. "And the photograph? You destroyed it, I presume?" Tim nodded, his hands trembling in the constable's grip. "Burned it the night he died. I couldn't risk anyone else seeing it." Daventry signalled the constable, who led Tim away, his footsteps heavy on the coral path. Miss Marple settled, back in her chair, her knitting resumed, her mind noting the confession's clarity, its gaps yet to be filled. She recalled a St. Mary Mead confession, where a poacher's admission had left unanswered questions about his accomplice. Tim's guilt, she suspected, was not the whole story, and she resolved to probe further. As the bungalow emptied, Mr. Raphael lingered, his wheelchair blocking the doorway. "You played that like a master, Miss Marple," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "But you're not done, are you? There's more to this, and you know it." Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "You're very perceptive, Mr. Raphael. Let's just say I find partial truths unsatisfying." She thanked him, her eyes twinkling, and he wheeled away, his laugh echoing in the night. Miss Marple remained by her window, the sea's murmur, a quiet companion. her thoughts a tapestry of clues. Tim's confession, the burned photograph, Molly's fear, Esther's note. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a killer's arrest had revealed a hidden partner. Here, too, she sensed a shadow behind Tim, a hand guiding his actions. She would continue to watch, to listen, her frail figure, a quiet sentinel in the Caribbean, dark, knowing that the truth, like the tide, would reveal its secrets in time. Chapter 10. The Lover Revealed. The Caribbean dawn broke over St. Honoré with a gentle radiance, its soft light filtering through the palm fronds to bathe the Golden Palm Hotel in hues of pink and gold. The air was warm, scented with the faint sweetness of frangipani, and the sea's rhythmic murmur provided a soothing counterpoint to the tension that still lingered in the hotel's quiet corners. Miss Jane Marple, seated on the veranda in her familiar wicker chair, felt the morning's warmth ease her rheumatism, but her mind was as sharp as a freshly honed blade, slicing through the complexities of the case that had unfolded. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, her tea cooling in its cup, as her eyes, veiled by a gentle demeanour, surveyed the scene. Tim Kendall's arrest the previous night had been a triumph, but Miss Marple knew the web of deceit was not fully unravelled. There were threads yet to be tugged, secrets yet to be exposed. Her thoughts returned to Tim's confession, his admission to poisoning Major Palgrave and Victoria Johnson to protect a past identity revealed by that fateful photograph. Yet his, words though damning, had left gaps, unanswered questions about Molly Kendall's fragile state, Esther Walters' furtive note to Greg Dyson, and the unseen figure in the garden who had overheard Tim's whispered assurances. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead case, where a grocer's confession to theft had masked his wife's role in a larger fraud. Here, too, she suspected an accomplice, someone whose motives intertwined with Tim's, perhaps driven by love, greed, or fear. The photograph was gone, burned by Tim's own hand, but its shadow lingered, and Miss Marple was determined to trace its final echoes. The veranda was slowly coming to life, the guests emerging with cautious steps, their voices hushed as news of Tim's arrest spread like ripples on a pond. Canon Prescott stood by the lawn, his round face creased with disbelief, murmuring to a waiter who nodded solemnly. Joan Prescott, her pince-nez glinting, sat alone, her notebook open but untouched, her eyes darting toward the reception where Molly Kendall, pale and drawn, stood with Dr. Graham, her hands clasped tightly. Mr. Raphael, wheeled to his usual spot, watched the scene with a hawk's intensity, his gaunt frame swathed in linen, his lips curled in a knowing smirk. Esther Walters, sorting papers at the reception, moved with a nervous energy, her glances fleeting and fearful. Miss Marple sipped her tea, its bitterness grounding her, and considered her next move. Tim's confession had confirmed her suspicions of his guilt. But Molly's nightmares, described by the canon as visions of shadows and guilt, suggested she knew more than she had revealed. Esther's note to Greg Dyson, witnessed by Joan, hinted at a hidden alliance, one that might explain her trembling hands and evasive answers. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead seamstress, whose secret letters to a lover had exposed a shared crime. Esther, she suspected, was the key to the remaining mystery, her fear a beacon to the truth. Her morning began with a deliberate approach to Molly Kendall, whom she found alone in the hotel's lounge, staring at a vase of hibiscus with unseeing eyes. Miss Marple, her shawl slipping slightly, adopted her guise of a kindly aunt, her voice soft with sympathy. "Mrs. Kendall, my dear, you look so tired," she said, settling beside her. "This dreadful business with your husband must be such a shock. I do hope you're managing." Molly's eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, met Miss Marple's, a flicker of anguish crossing her face. It's unthinkable," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Tim, doing such things. I can't believe it. But I've been so confused, Miss Marple, with these headaches, these dreams." Her hands twisted her scarf, her knuckles white. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle but searching. "Dreams can be so troubling, can't they? I heard you've been seeing shadows, feeling guilty. Is there something weighing on you, my dear?" Molly's breath caught, her eyes widening. "Guilty? Who said that? I don't know what I've done. It's all a blur, like I'm not myself." She paused, then added, "Tim's been so kind, always there. But now I wonder, was he keeping me this way?" Her voice trembled and she looked away, her scarf knotting tighter. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained placid. "Keeping you this way?" she echoed, her tone all sympathy. "You mean your illness, perhaps? It must be so hard, not feeling yourself." Molly nodded, her eyes distant. "Dr. Graham says it's stress, but I've been taking pills, something Tim gave me. They make me sleepy, foggy. I thought they were helping, but now—" She trailed off, her hands trembling. Miss Marple thanked her, her smile disarming, and withdrew, her mind racing. Molly's words, she thought, were a crucial thread. Pills from Tim, inducing fog and fear, perhaps to control her or mask his crimes. She recalled a St. Mary midwife, whose tonics from her husband had dulled, her senses hiding his affair. Tim's devotion, she suspected, was a calculated act, its purpose tied to the hotel's wealth and Molly's vulnerability. Determined to confront Esther Walters, Miss Marple sought her out in the hotel office, where she found her sorting invoices, with a distracted air, her face pale beneath her neat bun. Miss Marple entered with the air of a confused guest, her parasol a prop of frailty. "Miss Walters, I do hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice tremulous. "I was just thinking of poor Mrs. Kendall and how much you've helped her. But you seem so troubled yourself, my dear. Is there something on your mind?" Esther's pen clattered to the desk, her eyes wide with panic. "Troubled? No, I'm just busy, Miss Marple. It's been a difficult time with Tim and everything." Her hands twisted a paperclip, bending it out of shape. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her gaze was piercing. "Of course, it's been dreadful. I heard you passed a note to Mr. Dyson, though, and I wondered if it was about the hotel, or perhaps something more personal." Esther's face drained of colour, her breath catching. "A note? Who told you that?" She glanced at the door, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It was nothing, just a message about supplies. Please, Miss Marple, don't make trouble." Miss Marple leaned closer, her voice gentle but firm. "My dear, I'm not here to make trouble, but to help. I know you've been close to Tim, perhaps closer than most, and I think you're afraid because you know what he's done and what you've done with him." Esther's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling violently. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Tim and we fell in love months ago. He said Molly was holding him back, that the hotel was hers, her money. We planned to make her seem unfit, to take control." She sobbed, her words tumbling out. "I gave her sedatives, mixed them in her tea, to make her confused, weak. Tim said it was just temporary, but then Palgrave died, and Victoria, and I knew he was killing to protect us." Miss Marple's heart ached, but her resolve was unshaken. "And the note to Mr. Dyson," she pressed, her voice steady. Esther's sobs quieted, her eyes haunted. "I was desperate, thought Greg might help, lend us money to leave, but he didn't know anything, just thought I was upset about Victoria. I was so scared, Miss Marple, but I couldn't stop Tim." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch gentle, but her mind racing. "You've been very brave to tell me, my dear," she said. "You must tell Inspector Daventry everything. It's the only way to make things right." She rose, her shawl slipping slightly, and guided Esther to the reception, where a waiter was dispatched to fetch the inspector. Daventry arrived swiftly, his notebook open, his face grim as Esther, still trembling, repeated her confession. "I didn't know about the murders at first," she said, her voice hoarse. "But I helped with Molly, gave her the drugs. Tim said it was for us, for our future." She looked at Miss Marple, her eyes pleading. "I'm so sorry." Daventry's pen scratched, his eyes narrowing. "You're admitting to conspiracy, Miss Walters," he said, his voice clipped. "We'll need a full statement, and you'll be held for questioning." He signalled a constable who led Esther away, her steps faltering, but her head bowed in resignation. Miss Marple returned to the veranda, her knitting resumed, her mind sifting through Esther's words. The sedatives, she thought, explained Molly's fog, her nightmares, her fear. Tim's plan, to discredit Molly and seize her wealth, mirrored a St. Mary Mead scheme, where a nephew had drugged his aunt to claim her estate. Esther's role, born of love and desperation, was a tragic echo of a village girl's blind devotion to a rogue. Yet Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing the truth was nearly complete. She sought out Mr. Raphael, finding him by the pool, his wheelchair glinting in the morning sun. "Miss Marple, you've done it again," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Got the girl to crack, didn't you? But you're still not satisfied, are you?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, but knowing. "You're very perceptive, Mr. Raphael. The puzzle is nearly solved, but there are always loose ends. I like things tidy, don't you?" Raphael's laugh was a bark, his eyes glinting. "Tidy, eh? You're a terror, old girl. Keep at it." He wheeled away, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. As the morning unfolded, the hotel's atmosphere lightened, the guests' chatter less strained, their glances less wary. Miss Marple, dining alone, observed the dynamics with the clinicians' eye. Lucky Dyson's laughter was softer, her flirtation subdued, while Greg's grin was more genuine. Edward and Evelyn Hillingdon sat together, their silence less fraught, a tentative bridge between them. Molly, under Dr. Graham's care, moved with a fragile hope, her scarf loosened, her eyes clearer. Miss Marple, her fork poised over a slice of papaya, noted these signs, sensing the hotel's heart beginning to heal. She retired to her bungalow, the sea's murmur a quiet companion, her thoughts a tapestry of clues. Tim's murders, Esther's confession, Molly's recovery. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a lover's betrayal had closed a case but left a village wiser. Here, too, she sensed the truth's power, its light dispelling the shadows of deceit. She would remain vigilant, her frail figure a quiet sentinel, knowing that justice, like the dawn, brought clarity to the darkest corners. Chapter 11. The Pieces Fall. The Caribbean morning unfolded over St. Honoré with a serene brilliance, the sun's golden rays piercing the canopy of palms to dapple the Golden Palm Hotel's grounds in light and shadow. The air was warm, laced with the delicate perfume of oleander and the briny whisper of the sea, yet a faint residue of tension lingered, like the aftertaste of bitter tea. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her accustomed wicker chair on the veranda, felt the heat soothe her aging joints, but her mind was a whirl of precision, piecing together the final fragments of the puzzle that had consumed her days. Her knitting lay folded beside her, a prop unneeded for the moment, as her eyes, gentle but piercing, surveyed the hotel's quiet rhythm. Tim Kendall's arrest and Esther Walters' confession had brought clarity to the murders of Major Palgrave and Victoria Johnson. But Miss Marple, with the instinct of a village sleuth, knew that understanding the full scope of the crime was as vital as catching the culprits. Her tea, served in a porcelain cup, cooled untouched as she reflected on the web of deceit she had unravelled. Tim's admission to poisoning Palgrave, driven by the fear of exposure from that burned photograph, and his murder of Victoria, who had stumbled upon his secret, had confirmed her suspicions. Esther's tearful confession, revealing her role in drugging Molly to secure the hotel's wealth, had tied the threads together. Yet Miss Marple sought the deeper pattern, the why and how of their actions, the human frailties that had led to such darkness. She recalled a St. Mary Mead case, where a baker's confession to poisoning a rival had required careful sifting to reveal the greed and jealousy beneath. Here, too, she sensed a story of ambition and betrayal, its contours mirroring the scandals of her village. The veranda was slowly awakening, the guests moving with a cautious ease, their voices softer but less strained, as if the arrests had lifted a weight from the hotel's heart. Canon Prescott stood by the lawn, his round face creased with relief as he chatted with a young couple, his pastoral warmth restored. Joan Prescott, her pince-nez catching the sunlight, sat with her notebook, her sketches resuming with a newfound vigour. Mr. Raphael, wheeled to his usual perch, watched the scene with a sardonic glint, his gaunt frame relaxed, but his eyes ever watchful. Molly Kendall, under Dr. Graham's care, appeared at the reception, her auburn hair loose, her movements tentative but steadier, a sign of recovery from the sedatives that had clouded her mind. Esther Walters was absent, her place taken by a new secretary, a quiet girl whose efficiency contrasted with Esther's nervous fidgets. Miss Marple's morning had begun with a visit from Inspector Daventry, who sought her out on the veranda, his notebook tucked under his arm, his face lined but resolute. "Miss Marple, you've been a godsend in this case," he said, settling beside her, his voice gruff but warm. "Tim Kendall's confession is solid, and Miss Walters's statement corroborates it. We're building a timeline, but I'd value your thoughts on how it all fits together." Miss Marple's smile was faint, her eyes twinkling with the modesty she wielded so deftly. "Oh, Inspector, I'm just an old lady with too much time to think," she said, her voice soft. "But I'd be happy to share my fancies, if they're of use. Shall we start with Major Palgrave?" Daventry nodded, his pen poised. "Please, Tim's story is clear, but I want to ensure we've missed nothing." Miss Marple leaned back, her shawl adjusted against the breeze, her mind tracing the sequence with the clarity of a village chronicle. Major Palgrave, as you know, recognized Tim Kendall from a photograph, a snapshot from a fraud case in London years ago, when Tim was known by another name. Palgrave, with his love of stories, couldn't resist showing the picture, first to me, then to Tim himself. That was his mistake. Tim, fearing exposure, acted swiftly, lacing Palgrave's rum punch with poison, likely barbiturates, the same used on Victoria. He swapped the Major's Serenity tablets with his own, a clever touch to suggest heart failure, knowing Dr. Graham's cursory examination would miss the truth. Daventry's pen scratched, his brow furrowing. And Victoria? How did she fit in? Miss Marple's eyes softened, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. Victoria, poor girl, was too observant. She cleaned Palgrave's room and found the original Serenite bottle, perhaps hidden or misplaced by Tim in his haste. She asked questions, maybe even confronted him, thinking it a minor discrepancy. Tim, already desperate, saw her as a threat. He gave her barbiturates, perhaps in a drink, as with Palgrave, and lured her to the cliffs, staging a fall. The poison ensured she wouldn't survive, even if the fall alone wasn't fatal. Daventry nodded, his expression grim. That matches the autopsy. Barbiturates in her system, not enough to kill outright, but enough to disorient. The fall did the rest. And Molly Kendall? Esther's role in that? Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a reflex as she spoke. Molly was the heart of their plan, Inspector. The hotel, funded by her inheritance, was her domain, but Tim and Esther wanted it for themselves. Esther, in love with Tim, agreed to drug Molly with sedatives, mixed into her tea or food, to induce confusion, nightmares, and weakness. They hoped to portray her as unfit, perhaps even to institutionalize her, leaving Tim in control of the hotel's wealth. Molly's illness was no accident, but a calculated betrayal, one that mirrored a St. Mary Mead case where a nephew drugged his aunt to seize her savings. Daventry's pen paused, his eyes narrowing, and the note Esther passed to Greg. Dyson. We found it, vague, asking for help, mentioning money. What was that about? Miss Marple's smile was faint, her eyes searching. Esther's desperation, I think. She was unravelling, torn by guilt and fear as Tim's crimes escalated. She turned to Greg, perhaps hoping he could lend money for her and Tim to flee, or simply seeking an ally. Greg, unaware of the murders, thought it was about Victoria's death, and dismissed it. Esther's mistake was underestimating Tim's ruthlessness. She thought she could control the situation, but she was as trapped as Molly. Daventry leaned back, his notebook closing with a snap. That's a tidy picture, Miss Marple. Tim's motive was greed and fear of exposure. Esther's was love and ambition. We'll charge them both. Tim for murder, Esther for conspiracy and attempted harm to Molly. Anything else we should look for? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her voice soft but firm. Just one thing, Inspector. Ensure Molly is tested for those sedatives. Dr. Graham should confirm they're clearing her system to aid her recovery. And keep an eye on the other guests. Fear can make people reckless, and there may be smaller secrets yet to surface. Daventry rose, his smile wry. You're a marvel, Miss Marple. I'll follow through. And if you ever tire of knitting, we could use you on the force. He tipped his hat and strode off, his steps purposeful. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting resumed, her mind sifting through the timeline she had laid out. The pieces, she thought, fit neatly, yet the human cost, Palgrave's trust, Victoria's, curiosity, Molly's betrayal, echoed the tragedies of St. Mary Mead, where greed and love so often intertwined. She recalled a village widow, whose husband's murder had left her wiser but wounded. Molly, she hoped, would find similar strength. Her thoughts were interrupted by Mr. Raphael, who wheeled himself beside her, his nurse dismissed with a curt gesture. Miss Marple, you've tied it up like a Christmas parcel, he said, his voice a dry rasp. Tim and Esther caught red-handed, but you're still thinking, aren't you? What's left? Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. Oh, Mr. Raphael, you do see through me, she said, her needles clicking. The case is solved, but I like to understand the why of things. Tim's fear, Esther's love, Molly's trust. They're the same stories I've seen in my village, dressed in tropical colours. Human nature, you know, is the same everywhere. Raphael's laugh was a bark, his eyes glinting. Human nature, eh? You're a philosopher, old girl. But you're right. It's always greed or passion, isn't it? Here's to you, Nemesis, for sniffing it out. He raised an imaginary glass, his grin wolfish. Miss Marple chuckled, her eyes twinkling. Nemesis? Oh, I'm just a gossipy spinster, Mr. Raphael. But I do like a tidy ending. She thanked him, her mind noting his nickname with a quiet amusement, its aptness a nod to her relentless pursuit of justice. As the morning unfolded, Miss Marple watched the hotel's rhythm with a clinician's eye. Lucky Dyson and Greg lounged by the pool, their laughter lighter, their glances less guarded. Edward and Evelyn Hillingdon sat together, their conversation tentative but warmer, a sign of mending. Molly, guided by Dr. Graham, moved with a fragile grace, her scarf discarded, her eyes clearer. The canon passing by offered Miss Marple a warm nod, his relief palpable. Joan Prescott, sketching a palm, glanced up with a smile. Her gossip now turned to the island's birds. Miss Marple, dining alone at luncheon, savoured the spiced fish, her fork poised as she reflected on the case's resolution. The hotel, she thought, was healing, its guests reclaiming their ease, yet the scars of betrayal would linger, as they had in St. Mary Mead after a poisoner's arrest. She recalled a village girl whose lover's crime had taught her caution, but not despair. Molly, she hoped, would find a similar path, her strength rekindled by truth. She retired to her bungalow in the afternoon, the sea's murmur a quiet companion, her thoughts a tapestry of lessons learned. The case, she knew, was a mirror to her. Village's dramas, its players driven by the same frailties, greed, love, fear, that she had seen time and again. She would carry these lessons back to St. Mary Mead, her knitting bag a repository of wisdom as much as wool. For Miss Marple, the world was a village, its secrets waiting to be unravelled by a quiet spinster with a keen eye and a steadfast heart. Chapter 12. Departure. The Caribbean sun blazed over St. Honoré, its golden light softening the edges of the Golden Palm Hotel's whitewashed bungalows and glinting off the turquoise sea. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of salt and bougainvillea, and the rhythmic crash of waves mingled with the soft chatter of guests preparing for their day. Miss Jane Marple, seated on the veranda for her final morning, felt the heat wrap around her like a shawl, easing the faint ache in her joints. Her knitting bag rested beside her, its contents neatly packed, and her tea, served in a delicate porcelain cup, steamed gently, its tartness a familiar anchor. The case that had consumed her stay, Major Palgrave's poisoning, Victoria Johnson's murder, and the unravelling of Tim Kendall and Esther Walters' conspiracy, had been resolved, yet her mind, ever restless, sifted through its lessons, as she might a village scandal back in St. Mary Mead. The veranda, once shadowed by fear, hummed with a tentative cheer, the guests reclaiming their ease as the arrests of Tim and Esther restored a sense of safety. Canon Prescott stood by the lawn, his round face beaming as he shared a joke with a young waiter, his pastoral warmth undimmed by recent events. Joan Prescott, her pince-nez glinting, sat with her sketchbook, capturing the curve of a palm with renewed vigour, her gossip now turned to the island's vibrant bird life. Mr. Raphael, wheeled to his usual spot by his nurse, Jackson, surveyed the scene with a sardonic glint, his gaunt frame relaxed, but his eyes sharp, as if daring the world to surprise him again. Molly Kendall, under Dr. Graham's attentive care, moved through the reception with a fragile grace, her auburn hair loose, her smile hesitant but genuine, a sign of her slow recovery from the sedatives that had clouded her mind. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes soft but searching, and reflected on the case's conclusion. Tim's confession, extracted in the trap she had set, had revealed his poisoning of Palgrave to silence a past fraud, and his murder of Victoria to cover her discovery of the tampered selenite tablets. Esther's tearful admission, spurred by Miss Marple's gentle probing, had exposed her role in drugging Molly, a scheme driven by love and ambition to seize the hotel's wealth. The pieces, as she had explained to Inspector Daventry, fit neatly, a photograph burned to ash, a maid's curiosity silenced, a wife's trust betrayed, yet Miss Marple saw beyond the mechanics of the crime, to the human frailties, greed, fear, misplaced devotion that echoed the dramas of St. Mary Mead. She recalled a village widow whose husband's betrayal had left her wiser but not broken, and hoped Molly would find a similar strength. Her morning had begun with a quiet farewell to Dr. Graham, whom she found in his office, his silver hair catching the light as he reviewed Molly's chart. Miss Marple, her shawl slipping slightly, thanked him for his care, her voice soft with sincerity. "Dr. Graham, you've been so kind to Mrs. Kendall," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I do hope she's on the mend, now that those dreadful sedatives are out of her system." Dr. Graham's smile was warm, his hands folding the chart with care. "She's improving daily, Miss Marple. The blood tests confirmed barbiturates, as you suspected, but they're clearing now. With rest and time, she'll be herself again. You've done her a great service, you know, uncovering the truth." Miss Marple's smile was faint, her modesty a practised shield. "Oh, I just noticed a few things, Doctor. It's what old ladies do, isn't it? Fuss over details." She paused, then added, "Will you keep an eye on her after I'm gone? She's been through so much." Dr. Graham nodded, his expression earnest. "Of course, Miss Marple. Molly's strong, stronger than she knows. And the hotel's in good hands now, with a new manager arriving next week." He chuckled, a touch of admiration in his voice. "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Marple. St. Honoré won't forget you." She thanked him and withdrew, her mind noting his kindness, his steady presence a contrast to the deceit she had uncovered. As she returned to the veranda, she encountered Canon Prescott, who approached with a warm nod, his clerical collar gleaming. "Miss Marple, I hear you're leaving us," he said, his voice rich with regret. "You've been a blessing, you know, sorting out this terrible business. The island owes you a debt." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her smile gentle. "Oh, Canon, you're too kind. I've just been a nosy old woman, that's all. But I shall miss St. Honoré's beauty and your charming company." She paused, her voice softening. "Do look after Mrs. Kendall, won't you? She'll need friends now." The Canon's face sobered, his hands clasped. "Indeed, I will. Poor Molly's been through a trial, but she's resilient. I've promised to visit, perhaps read to her from the Psalms. There's comfort in faith, don't you think?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling a St. Mary Mead parishioner, whose recovery from betrayal had been eased by the vicar's visits. "There is, Canon," she said, "and in truth, too." She bid him farewell, her heart lightened by his sincerity, and resumed her seat, her knitting bag a quiet companion. Her thoughts were interrupted by Mr. Raphael, who wheeled himself beside her, his nurse dismissed with a curt wave. "Miss Marple, you're off to your village, eh?" he said, his voice a dry rasp, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Solved our little puzzle, and now you're done. But I'll wager you're already sniffing out the next one." Miss Marple's laugh was soft, her eyes meeting his with a shared understanding. "Oh, Mr. Raphael, you do make me sound so grand," she said, her needles clicking reflexively. "I'm just going home to my roses and my knitting. But I confess, I do find people interesting wherever I go." Raphael's grin was wolfish, his bony hands gripping his chair. "Interesting, eh? That's one way to put it. You're a regular nemesis, old girl, cutting through the nonsense. I'd back you against any detective in London." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Come back next year and I'll bankroll it. We could stir up some fun, you and I." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her smile faint but knowing. "A tempting offer, Mr. Raphael, but I think St. Mary Mead will keep me busy enough. There's always a bit of mischief to untangle, even in a village." She paused, her voice softening. "But I shall remember your kindness, and your sharp eyes. They've been a great help." Raphael's laugh was a bark, his head tilting back. "Sharp eyes, eh? Takes one to know one. Safe travels, Miss Marple, and watch your back. Nemesis doesn't get a holiday." He wheeled away, his chuckle echoing, leaving Miss Marple with a quiet amusement at his nickname, its aptness a nod to her relentless pursuit of truth. As the morning unfolded, Miss Marple watched the hotel's rhythm with a clinician's eye, noting the subtle shifts in its dynamics. Lucky Dyson and Greg lounged by the beach, their laughter genuine, their flirtations tempered by a newfound caution. Edward and Evelyn Hillingdon sat together, their conversation halting but earnest, a fragile bridge spanning their long silence. Molly, assisting a guest at the reception, moved with a quiet confidence, her scarf replaced by a simple necklace, a sign of her reclaiming herself. The staff, too, seemed lighter, their smiles less forced, their steps brisker, as if the hotel's heart had begun to beat anew. At luncheon, Miss Marple savoured the island's spiced fish and mango, her fork poised as she reflected on her time at the Golden Palm. The case, she thought, had been a mirror to St. Mary Mead's dramas, its players driven by the same frailties, greed, love, fear, that she had seen in her village's quiet lanes. Tim's ambition, Esther's devotion, Molly's trust were not so different from the grocer's envy, the seamstress's passion, or the widow's betrayal she had known at home. Yet the Caribbean's vibrant colours, its languid pace, had lent the story a new hue, one she would carry back to her cottage, to share over tea with her friend Dolly Bantry. Her final task was to pack, a methodical process that mirrored her approach to mysteries. She folded her dresses with care, tucked her Bible into her suitcase, and placed her knitting bag atop it all, its needles a quiet testament to her vigilance. As she worked, she thought of the guests she had come to know, the Cannons, warmth, Joan's gossip, Raphael's cynicism, Molly's resilience. Each had played a part, their actions and reactions weaving the tapestry she had unravelled. She recalled a St. Mary Mead farewell, when a solved case had left the village wiser but kinder, its bonds strengthened by truth. Here, too, she sensed a healing, the hotel's spirit buoyed by the clarity she had brought. In the afternoon, Miss Marple took a final walk through the grounds, her parasol shielding her from the sun, her steps slow but deliberate. The coral paths crunched underfoot, the hibiscus bloomed in vivid reds and pinks, and the sea sparkled beyond the cliffs, its beauty undimmed by the tragedies it had witnessed. She paused by the spot where Molly had wandered, her murmurs of shadows, a haunting memory, and felt a quiet satisfaction that the young woman was free of her torment. She thought of Victoria, her bright smile silenced, and Palgrave, his stories cut short, and offered a silent prayer for their peace, as she might in St. Mary Mead's church. Her taxi arrived at dusk, its driver a cheerful man who loaded her, suitcase with care. Miss Marple bid farewell to the staff, her smile warm, her words simple but heartfelt. Molly approached, her eyes clear, her hand extended. "Miss Marple, I can't thank you enough," she said, her voice steady but soft. "You've given me my life back. I'll never forget you." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch gentle but firm. "My dear, you're stronger than you know. Live well and trust your heart." She smiled, her eyes twinkling, and stepped into the taxi, her shawl a quiet shadow about her. As the taxi wound through St. Honoré's lush hills, Miss Marple gazed at the passing palms, the fading light painting the island in hues of crimson and indigo. She thought of St. Mary Mead, its roses waiting, its gossips simmering, and felt a quiet eagerness to return. The Caribbean had been a vivid chapter, its mysteries as intricate as any village scandal, but home called with its familiar rhythms. She would sit by her fire, her knitting in hand, and recount this tale to Dolly, her voice soft but laced with the thrill of the chase, for Miss Marple knew that wherever she went, human folly would spin its webs, and she, with her sharp eyes and quiet heart, would be ready to unravel them. The taxi reached the harbour, the sea a dark mirror under the stars. Miss Marple boarded, her ship, her steps steady, her knitting bag a faithful companion. As St. Honoré receded, its lights twinkling like distant candles, she leaned against the railing, the breeze stirring her shawl. The world, she thought, was a village, its secrets waiting for a spinster's touch. And with that, she turned toward home, her mind already turning to the small dramas of St. Mary Mead, certain that mystery, like the tide, would always find her.